Tonight, picture a wide and level plain at the very end of a long summer day, a plain so flat that the eye can travel for miles and find nothing to stop it, and across that plain 2 great rivers move slowly toward the sea, brown and patient and heavy with the silt of far-off mountains. The light is going amber and then a soft dusty gold, and a warm wind comes down from the north and moves through the reeds along the water so that they lean and whisper and lean again. There are no cities here yet. There are no kings, no walls, no temples climbing toward the sky. There is only the mud and the water and the long grass and a few thin threads of smoke rising from small fires where a handful of people have chosen, for reasons they could not have fully explained, to stay in one place instead of moving on. Tonight we are going to sit with those small fires, and we are going to watch, very slowly, as that empty plain becomes the first place on earth where human beings learn to live together in great numbers, to write down their thoughts, to build toward heaven, to make laws, to raise empires, and to lose them again. This is the entire story of ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the 2 rivers, the place many people call the cradle of civilization, and it is a story that stretches across more than 3,000 years, from the first mud brick hut to the last of the great kings, and we are going to walk through all of it, gently and without hurry, the way you might walk through a museum at closing time when the crowds have gone and the lights are low and there is nothing left to do but look and breathe and let your shoulders come down from around your ears. So before we begin, settle yourself now into whatever stillness you have made for this hour. Let the lamp grow dim, or let it go out altogether. Let the small weight of the day slip down from your shoulders 1 quiet inch at a time. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. There is nothing you need to carry into tomorrow. The rivers have been moving for 10,000 years, and they will keep moving whether or not you stay awake to hear about them, and so you are free, completely free, to let your eyes grow heavy and your breath grow slow, and to drift off whenever the drifting feels good. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys through history, you are welcome to leave a gentle like on this video, and to subscribe if you would like more of them, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here, and only if it takes no effort at all. And if you feel like it, before you fall asleep, you might leave your location and your local time down in the comments, because it quietly helps other sleepless people find their way here, and there is something comforting in knowing that all across the world, in different hours and different seasons, other people are lying in the dark listening to the same soft voice, waiting for the same easy sleep. Now let us begin, and let us begin as we always should, 1 layer before the story itself, in the time before there was any Mesopotamia at all. Before there was a Mesopotamia, there were only the 2 rivers, and the 2 rivers did not know they were important. They still do not. The one we now call the Tigris rose in the high snows of the mountains to the north, and ran fast and deep and a little dangerous, cutting straight and stubborn toward the south. The one we now call the Euphrates rose in the same cold country, but took a longer, lazier, more wandering road, looping west and then curving back east, as if it were in no particular hurry to arrive anywhere. For most of their long lives these 2 rivers ran apart, separated by a wide belt of dry land, and then, in the flat country near the bottom of the world they were carving, they drew close together, almost close enough to touch, before at last they joined and slid the final stretch to the warm shallow gulf. Between them, in that low place where they nearly met, lay a land that was, at first glance, not an obvious place to build a civilization at all. In the south it was flat and hot and treeless, baked hard in summer and flooded in spring, without stone to build with, without metal in the ground, without tall timber, without any of the things you might think a great people would need. What it had instead was mud, an endless supply of soft grey river mud, and water that could be moved, and a sky that gave almost no rain, but gave in its place 2 rivers that rose every year and spread themselves across the fields and left behind, when they withdrew, a fresh skin of dark, rich, astonishing soil. And that, in the end, was enough. That was more than enough, because in that soil, if you could tame the water, if you could persuade it to go where you wanted and to stay away when you did not, you could grow grain, and not just a little grain, but grain in such quantity that a family could eat all year and still have some left over, and it is that little phrase, still have some left over, that quietly contains the whole of what is coming. A surplus, food beyond the day's hunger, grain in a jar that did not need to be eaten tonight. That is the seed from which cities and temples and armies and kings and laws and writing itself would all, eventually, grow. The very first people to live in this land came slowly, over many centuries, drifting down out of the surrounding hills and marshes. And they were, to begin with, farmers and fishers and herders living in small scattered villages of reed and mud. We give the earliest of these long stretches of time quiet, unglamorous names, names that sound like the villages where the first bits of their pottery were found, and we need not weigh ourselves down with all of them tonight. It is enough to know that for a very long time, longer than all of recorded history put together, people lived here simply, in small numbers, following the seasons, burying their dead beneath the floors of their houses so the family stayed close even after death, and slowly, so slowly that no single person would ever have noticed it happening, learning the land. They learned when the rivers rose. They learned which fields flooded and which stayed dry. They learned to dig small channels to lead the water where the crops were, and to raise small banks to hold the water back where the crops were not. They learned, in other words, to argue with the river gently and patiently, the way you might reason with a large and powerful animal that could not be forced, but could sometimes be persuaded. And as they got better at this argument, something began to change, something with no drama in it at all, no battle, no invention you could point to, just a slow thickening of life. The villages that sat in the best places, where the water was easiest to manage and the soil was deepest, grew a little larger than their neighbours. They had a little more grain. They could feed a few people who did not farm, a potter perhaps, who made the jars the grain was stored in, or a weaver, or someone who tended the shrine of the local god. For these people had gods, many gods, one for the storm, and one for the fresh water, and one for the grain, and one for the moon. And every village kept a small house for its god, the way it kept houses for its living. And in the far south of the plain, in the marshy country near the gulf, where the reeds grow tall as a man on horseback, and the water lies still and warm between the islands of dry ground, one of these villages, over centuries, grew and grew and did not stop growing, until it had become something the world had never seen before. We will come to that place soon, and when we do, we will slow down even further, because it deserves it, because it is, in a real sense, the beginning of everything we mean when we say the word civilization. But for now, simply hold the picture. Hold the flat plain and the two slow rivers and the small fires and the smell of wet mud and cut reeds and baking bread. Hold the quiet fact that somewhere out there, in a village whose name is now lost, someone has just stored more grain than their family can eat, and has set the extra aside, and has, without knowing it, without meaning to, opened a door that the human race would walk through and never come back from. Let that picture settle over you now like a warm blanket settling. Slowly, over still water. There is no hurry. We have 3,000 years ahead of us, and all the time in the world. The village in the far south that grew and did not stop growing came to be called Uruk, and if we could stand at its edge in the years around 4,000 years before the birth of Christ, we would see something that had simply never existed anywhere on the planet before. We would see a city. Not a large village, not a cluster of huts, but a true city, with tens of thousands of people living close together behind a great wall. A wall that later stories would say was built by a king so proud of it that he wanted his name remembered for as long as the bricks stood. The houses pressed shoulder to shoulder along narrow winding lanes, and the smoke of 10,000 cooking fires hung over the rooftops in the evening, and out beyond the wall the fields ran green and geometric to the horizon, cut through with the straight silver lines of canals that the people had dug by hand, basket of mud by basket of mud, over many generations. And at the centre of it all rose the first of the great temples. A broad platform of mud brick lifted high above the flat land, and on top of the platform a shrine to the goddess of the city, so that anyone approaching across the plain would see, long before they saw the wall or the houses, that pale shape standing against the sky, the house of the god lifted up where the god could see and be seen. This raising of the temple onto a platform, and then, in later centuries, onto platform upon platform, step upon step, is the beginning of the ziggurat, the stepped temple mountain that would become the signature shape of this whole civilization, the thing we still picture when we picture ancient Mesopotamia, a great artificial hill of brick climbing toward heaven in a land that had no hills of its own. It is worth pausing tonight to feel how strange and how enormous a thing a city was. Every one of those tens of thousands of people had to be fed, every day, and none of the food grew inside the walls. It all had to come in from the fields, and be counted, and be stored, and be given out, and this simple, boring, endlessly repeated problem, the problem of keeping track of who had brought in how much grain, and who was owed how much bread, turns out to be one of the great engines of human history. Because it is the problem that gave us writing. Writing was not invented by a poet. It was not invented by a king who wanted his glory remembered, though kings would later use it for exactly that. Writing was invented, as far as we can tell, by accountants, by the patient temple officials who needed to remember how many jars of grain and how many sheep and how many measures of oil had come and gone, and who found at last a way to make clay remember it for them. At first they used small tokens, little shaped pieces of clay, one shape for a measure of grain, another for a jar of oil, another for a head of cattle, and they would seal these tokens inside a hollow ball of clay as a kind of permanent record, so that no one could argue later about what had been agreed. But sealing the tokens inside a ball had an obvious flaw, which is that once it was sealed you could no longer see what was inside, and so people began to press the tokens into the soft outside of the ball before sealing them up, to leave a mark of what was within. And then, one day, some quiet, unremembered genius realized that if the marks on the outside told you everything you needed to know, you did not need the tokens on the inside at all. You did not even need the ball. You needed only a flat tablet of wet clay and a way of making the marks. And so they took a reed and cut its end into a small wedge and pressed that wedge into the clay in careful groups, and the marks it made were shaped like little wedges. And because the old word for wedge gives us the name, we call this writing cuneiform, the wedge writing, the first true writing in the history of the world. Think of that for a moment as you lie there in the dark. Think of a person sitting cross-legged in the shade of a temple wall 5,000 years ago, with a lump of wet clay balanced on one knee and a cut reed in one hand, pressing small wedges into the surface to record that a man delivered 29 measures of barley to the temple of the goddess. It is the dullest possible sentence. It is a receipt. And yet with that receipt the human race crossed a line it had never crossed in all the hundreds of thousands of years before, the line between a thing remembered only in a living mind and a thing set down outside the mind, in the world, where it could outlast the person who wrote it, and be read by someone they would never meet, in a time they could not imagine. Everything we know about these people, in the end, we know because they wrote it in clay, and clay, unlike paper, unlike parchment, unlike almost anything else human beings have ever written on, does not rot and does not burn. When a Mesopotamian city was sacked and its buildings set on fire, the fire did to the clay tablets what a kiln does to a pot. It baked them hard. It made them nearly immortal. And so, buried in the ruins of these burned cities, hundreds of thousands of clay tablets have waited, patiently for thousands of years, for someone to dig them up and learn, slowly and painfully, how to read them again. At first, the writing could only record things, quantities, lists, receipts, the endless bookkeeping of the temple storehouses. But writing, once it exists, does not like to stay in its box. Little by little the scribes found ways to make their wedges stand not just for things but for sounds, so that they could write not only 29 measures of barley, but the name of the man who brought them, and not only his name, but the words he might say. And once you can write the words a person says, you can write anything. A prayer, a law, a letter, a boast, a lament, a joke, a story. The training of a scribe became one of the most important things a young person could do, and it was hard, brutally hard, years of sitting in a school the Sumerians called, rather beautifully, the tablet house, copying signs over and over until the hand ached, memorizing hundreds and then thousands of wedge clusters, being caned. We are told from their own complaining tablets, for the smallest mistakes, for talking, for standing up without permission, for sloppy handwriting, which is a set of complaints so timeless that a schoolchild of today would recognize every one of them. But a scribe who finished this training held a kind of power that almost no one else in the world possessed. A scribe could make clay remember. A scribe could stand between the ordinary people and the great institutions of the temple and the palace, and read out what was owed and what was promised, and that made the scribe indispensable, and being indispensable in any age is a comfortable place to stand. The people who lived in Uruk and the other early southern cities called themselves, in their own tongue, by a word we render as Sumerian, and their land Sumer, and though we do not fully know where they came from or how their strange language, which is related to no other language on earth, living or dead, first arrived on that plain, we know that it was they who took all these first steps, the city, the temple mountain, the canal, the wheel, which they used first for the potter and later for the cart, and above all the written word. For a long stretch of centuries there was no single Sumerian kingdom, no one ruler over the whole land. Instead there were many cities, each proud, each with its own god and its own temple and its own patch of watered fields. Cities with names that have a soft music to them when you say them slowly in the dark. Uruk, and Ur, and Eridu, and Kish, and Lagash, and Nippur. Each one a little world unto itself, each one convinced that its god was the greatest, and its fields the finest, and each one, inevitably, quarrelling with its neighbours over the thing that mattered most in that dry land, which was never gold and never glory but always, in the end, water. The water in the canals was life, and there was never quite enough of it, and the city upstream could always, if it wished, take more than its share, and leave the city downstream to watch its barley wither, and so the cities fought, and made peace, and fought again, over boundary ditches and dredging rights and the exact placement of a dam, in the oldest recorded quarrels in human history, quarrels so ancient and so familiar that reading them now is like overhearing, very faintly, the first argument the human family ever wrote down. In the very earliest days, the person who managed a Sumerian city was not exactly a king in the way we later use the word. He was more like a steward of the god, a chief servant of the temple, the one who saw to it that the canals were dredged and the granaries kept and the festivals held, and his authority came not from armies or bloodlines, but from the god whose estate he managed. But the pressures of that quarrelsome, water-hungry, crowded plain slowly changed the nature of the office. When your neighbour city takes your water, someone has to organise the men who will go and take it back. And when the flood threatens the dikes, someone has to command the thousands of hands needed to save them. And in a crisis, people do not want a committee. They want a leader, one voice that decides, and one hand that points. And so, war by war and flood by flood, the temple steward gave way to something harder and more permanent. A war leader whose power did not end when the emergency ended. A man who kept his guards and his followers and his authority in peacetime too. And built himself a great house separate from the temple, a house we would call a palace, and passed his position to his son. This is the birth of kingship, and the Sumerians themselves felt it was so important, so fundamental, that they told a story about it, saying that kingship had descended from heaven, that it was a thing the gods had lowered down into the world of men like a gift, or perhaps like a burden, and that it had rested first upon one city and then, when that city fell, upon another, passing from place to place across the centuries, so that the whole history of the land could be told as the history of where the kingship happened to be resting at any given time. They wrote this history down in a document we now call the Sumerian King List, and it is a strange and haunting thing to read, because it begins in the deep mist of legend, with kings who are said to have reigned not for years but for tens of thousands of years. One for 28,000, and another for 36,000, impossible lifetimes that belong to myth. And then, as it comes down through the centuries toward the writer's own time, the reigns grow shorter and more human and more believable, until you realize you are watching, in a single document, the human race walking out of legend and into history, one king at a time. And among the names on that list, in the section that deals with the city of Uruk, sits a name that has travelled further through time than almost any other. The name of a king said to have reigned for 126 years, a number too round and too large to be true, but not too large to be legendary, and that name is Gilgamesh. We cannot be sure whether a real man named Gilgamesh ever lived, though many scholars think that behind the legend there stands a genuine early king of Uruk, a builder of walls, a figure remembered and then remembered so hard and so long that he swelled far beyond his human size. What we can be sure of is that the people of Mesopotamia loved his story, told it and retold it and copied it out onto tablet after tablet for well over 1,000 years in several languages, so that it became the first great work of literature in the history of the world. The oldest story we have that is not a list or a law or a receipt, but a true story, with a hero and a journey and a loss and a lesson, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it is, of all things, a story about coming to terms with death, which makes it a strangely fitting tale to tell in the last waking hour of a long day, when the mind naturally softens and the day's small deaths, the ended hours, the finished tasks, gather quietly around the edges of the bed. The story tells of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, part god and part man, so strong and so restless that he wearies his own people, until the gods create a wild man of the wilderness to be his match and his companion, a man named Enkidu, who lives among the animals until he is drawn into the world of the city. The two of them, king and wild man, become the closest of friends, and together they go adventuring into a distant cedar forest to face its monstrous guardian, and against a great bull sent down from heaven, and they are young and mighty and certain that the world cannot touch them, in the way that only the young and mighty ever are. And then Enkidu falls sick, and does not recover, and dies slowly in his bed, frightened and bewildered, and the whole bright confidence of the story goes out like a lamp. Gilgamesh, who has never truly believed that anything could be taken from him, sits with his dead friend until, in one of the most piercing lines to survive from the ancient world, he will not allow the body to be buried until a worm falls out of its nose, and only then does he understand, fully and finally, that his friend is gone and is not coming back, and that he too, king though he is, part god though he is, will one day lie down and not get up. And so he sets out on a long and desperate journey to escape death itself, to find the one man who is said to have been granted eternal life, a man who survived a great flood that the gods once sent to drown the world, and from whom, Gilgamesh hopes, the secret of not dying might be learned. It is worth stopping on that flood, because if it stirs something in the back of your mind, a memory of another flood story, of an ark and a dove and a mountain and a promise, you are not imagining it. The Mesopotamian flood story, in which the gods resolve to wipe out noisy, troublesome humanity with a deluge, and one righteous man is warned in time and builds a great boat and loads it with his family and the animals and rides out the storm, and sends out birds to search for dry land, and comes to rest at last upon a mountain, is older than the version most of us grew up with, and the resemblance is far too close to be an accident. These were the same lands, the same rivers, the same peoples, and the stories flowed between them across the centuries the way the water flowed down the two rivers. And to notice that is not to diminish anyone's sacred book, but to feel, with a small quiet shiver, how deep the roots of our stories go, how the tales we still tell our children were already old, already worn smooth by many hands, when the first stones of the great civilizations we usually think of as ancient were still lying unquarried in the ground. Gilgamesh reaches the survivor of the flood and is told the secret, which is that there is no secret, that death is the lot of humankind and always will be, that the gods kept eternal life for themselves and handed out only sleep and dreams and mornings to the rest of us. He is given one last chance, a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea that can at least restore a person's youth, and he dives for it and finds it and brings it up, and then, on the journey home, careless for a single moment, he sets it down by a pool to bathe, and a serpent slides out of the water and eats it, and is gone, shedding its skin as it goes, which is why the story says snakes can grow young again and men cannot. And Gilgamesh sits down and weeps because he has lost even that. But then he stands and goes home, and the very last thing the epic shows us is the hero standing before the great walls of his own city, the walls he built, and telling the man who travelled with him to look, to really look, at how fine and strong and enduring those walls are. He has understood, at last, the only kind of immortality a human being can actually have. Not to live forever, but to build something, or make something, or love something that outlasts you, that stands when you are gone, that lets a little of you remain in the world after the rest of you has slipped away. It is a lesson 4,000 years old, and it has not aged a day, and it is, in its gentle way, exactly the lesson the whole of this long story is going to teach us again and again tonight, as we watch city after city rise, and shine, and fall, and leave behind only their walls, their tablets, their quiet enduring gifts to everyone who came after. So let that thought rest lightly on you now, with no weight of sadness in it, only a kind of calm. Everything ends. And still, some things remain, and the remaining is enough. For century upon century the pattern held, many cities, no master, each king ruling his own small watered world and squabbling with the next, kingship passing from Kish to Uruk to Ur and back again like a lamp handed around a dark room. And then, a little more than 4,300 years ago, a man appeared who broke the pattern so completely that the world was never the same after him, and he did it not by being born to greatness but, if we can believe the legend that later gathered around him, by being born to almost nothing at all. His name, or the name history gave him, was Sargon, and the story he or his descendants liked to tell was that his mother was a humble priestess who bore him in secret and could not keep him, and so she made a small basket of reeds and sealed it with tar, the way you would waterproof a little boat, and laid the baby inside, and set the basket upon the river, and let the water carry him away. And the river carried him, and a man who drew water for the gardens found the basket, and lifted the child out and raised him as his own, and the boy grew up to be a gardener, and then, somehow, a cupbearer to the king of Kish, one of the most trusted servants in the royal household, and then, by means the legend leaves conveniently vague, a king himself, and not just a king, but the first true emperor in the history of the world. If that story of the baby in the reed basket on the river also stirs a memory, you are, once again, not imagining it. It is a very old shape for a story, the abandoned child of mysterious birth, who is set adrift and saved and rises to greatness, and it would be told again, in other lands and other centuries, about other founders and lawgivers and saviours, but as far as we know it was told first about Sargon, the gardener who became the master of the world. What Sargon actually did, beneath the legend, was to weld the quarrelsome cities of the south into a single realm under a single hand, and then to keep going, north and east and west, further than any ruler had ever reached, until his armies had marched to the shores of the Upper Sea and the Lower Sea, to the Cedar Mountains and the Silver Mountains, gathering city after city and land after land under one authority, one administration, one king. This had never been done. Cities had conquered their neighbours before, and kings had claimed grand titles before, but no one had ever held together so many different peoples, speaking different tongues, worshipping different gods, across so vast a stretch of country, and made it answer to a single centre. That is what an empire is, and Sargon built the first one, and we still use the word empire. And to hold it together he did the things that empire builders have done ever after. He kept a standing army, a body of soldiers who did nothing but soldier. 5,400 men, one text says, who ate their bread each day before him, the first professional army we know of. He appointed his own trusted men as governors of the conquered cities in place of their old local kings, so that the loyalty ran back to him. He installed his daughter as the high priestess of the moon god in the great city of binding the most powerful religious office in the land to his own family, and that daughter, whose name we render as Enheduanna, did something so remarkable that she deserves her own quiet moment in this story. Because she wrote poetry, hymns to the goddess of her devotion, and she signed them, she put her own name into them, she spoke in them as herself, about herself, her exile, her longing, her faith, and so she is the first author in all of human history whose name we know, the first person ever to write something and say, in effect, I made this, I am the one who made this. For thousands of years before her, writing had been anonymous, the voice of the temple, the voice of the king, the voice of no one in particular. She is the first individual human voice to reach us across the dark of time and say, this is mine. And it is a small miracle that the first such voice should belong not to a warrior or a king, but to a woman, a poet, a daughter of the empire, singing in the moonlight of the great ziggurat of Ur. Sargon's empire was rich and busy, and connected in a way the world had not been before, with trade goods flowing along the rivers and the roads from the mountains and the sea, cedar and copper and silver and lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone flecked with gold that the Mesopotamians loved above all others, and that had to be carried, we now know, across thousands of miles from a single valley in the distant mountains of the east. But an empire, once built, is a heavy thing to hold, and the same restless, proud, water-jealous cities that Sargon had gathered did not stop being restless and proud simply because a strong hand had closed around them. Again and again, we are told, the cities rose against him, and again he put them down, and even in his old age, the texts say, all the lands revolted against him and besieged him in his own city, and he marched out and scattered them, an old lion still, but you can hear under the boasting how much holding the empire cost, how it never for one moment held itself. His sons ruled after him, and his grandson, a king named Naram-Sin, pushed the empire to its greatest height and its greatest pride, so much pride that he did a thing no Mesopotamian king had ever dared before. He called himself a god, wrote his name with the little star sign that marked the names of gods, and had himself carved onto a great stone monument climbing a mountain, larger than his soldiers, wearing the horned helmet that only gods were allowed to wear, treading on the bodies of his enemies with the sun and the stars shining down on him alone. It is one of the most magnificent images to survive from the ancient world, and it is also, in a way, a warning, because pride like that, in the stories these people told themselves, never went unanswered for long, and indeed, not long after, the empire of Sargon fell, and it fell hard, and the people who lived through the falling reached, as people always do, for a reason, a meaning, a story that would make sense of the catastrophe. And the story they told was that Naram-Sin, in his pride, had offended the gods, had even, in one version, laid violent hands on the great temple at Nippur, the holiest place in all the land, and that the gods in their anger had unleashed upon the empire a wild and terrible people out of the eastern mountains, a people they described almost as a swarm, as locusts, as something barely human, who came down and shattered the roads and emptied the fields and put an end to the world's first empire. There was probably truth in it. The mountain peoples were real, and the raids were real, but modern eyes have found another culprit standing quietly behind the barbarians, older and colder and more patient than any army, and that culprit was the weather. The evidence in the earth suggests that around this time the climate turned against Mesopotamia, that the rains that fed the northern farms failed for years on end, that a long drought settled over the land and dried the fields to dust, and sent hungry people streaming south, straining the cities past what they could bear. And so the first empire may have been brought down less by the spears of the mountain men than by the silent failure of the rain, which is a sobering thought, and also, if we let it be, a strangely calming one, because it reminds us that even the mightiest works of the mightiest kings sit always in the palm of something far larger than themselves. The weather, the water, the slow turning of the sky, forces that no army can defeat and no wall can shut out. Forces as indifferent to a god-king carved upon a mountain as they are to you and to me, lying here in the warm dark, listening to the rain that may or may not come. After the fall of Sargon's empire and the long hungry years that followed, the land did not stay broken forever, because land like that, watered by two great rivers and worked by patient people who knew its every mood, does not stay broken for long. Out of the confusion, one of the old southern cities gathered its strength and rose again to greatness, and it was Ur, the moon god's city, the same Ur where Sargon's poet daughter had sung, and its kings built what many remember as the last great flowering of the old Sumerian world, a time we call, a little dryly, the third dynasty of Ur, as if it were merely the third chapter in a long municipal history, when in truth it was one of the most orderly and accomplished states the ancient world ever produced. Its founder was a king named Ur-Nammu, and he set about the work of a great ruler in the way the land had come to expect, by digging canals and repairing temples, and above all, by building, and the thing he built has stood, in part, for more than 4,000 years, and stands in part still, out on the flat plain under the enormous sky, so that a traveller today can walk up its ancient staircase and stand where the priests once stood. It is the great ziggurat of Ur, and it is the finest surviving example of that signature Mesopotamian shape. The Temple Mountain, a vast rectangular mass of mud brick, its lower stage alone rising as tall as a modern building, is tall, faced with baked brick set in tar to shield the soft mud core from the rare but ruinous rains. 3 great staircases converging at its front like the approach to heaven itself, and on its summit, long gone now, the little shrine of the moon god, the reason for all of it, the small holy room for whose sake a whole mountain had been raised by hand in a land without a single stone. Stand at its foot in your mind for a moment. Feel the warmth still coming off the brick as the sun goes down. Smell the tar and the dust and the smoke of the evening sacrifice. Hear the low sound of the hymns drifting down from above in a language nobody has spoken aloud in 4,000 years. And understand that everyone who built this, every labourer who carried the bricks and every scribe who counted them, and every king who commanded it, believed with their whole heart that they were making a stairway for their God to come down into the world, and that as long as the stairway stood and the offerings were made, the God would be pleased, and the rains would fall, and the rivers would rise, and the barley would grow, and the children would be born, and the great slow wheel of the good years would keep on turning. Ur-Nammu, or perhaps his son who finished his work, did one other thing that reaches down the centuries to touch us directly, something quieter than a ziggurat but in its own way just as monumental, because he gave his people a code of laws written out on clay, and it is the oldest surviving law code in the history of the world, older by 3 centuries than the far more famous laws we will come to soon. And what is striking about these very first written laws when you read them tonight is how humane many of them are, how much they care about the weak. Because the king, in his opening words, boasts not of his conquests, but of his justice, saying that he did not deliver the orphan to the rich, nor the widow to the powerful, nor the man of 1 shekel to the man of 1 mina, which is to say he did not let the poor man be crushed by the rich man, simply because the rich man could afford to crush him. And the laws themselves, many of them, do not demand an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but instead set fines, so many measures of silver for this injury and so many for that, a system that treated a man's broken bone as a wrong to be repaid rather than a wound to be matched, which many people, reading it now, find gentler and wiser than what came after. The kings of ran their realm with a passion for order and record-keeping that borders, frankly, on the obsessive, and this is a gift to us, because they wrote down everything, and the dry southern earth kept it. We have tens of thousands of tablets from this one short period, and they record the most astonishingly ordinary things: the receipt for a single dead sheep, the ration of beer and bread given to a temple weaver for 1 month, the delivery of reeds, the count of a herd down to the last lamb, the wages of a hired man for a single day of work. It can seem like the least romantic thing imaginable, a whole civilization's worth of paperwork, and yet there is something deeply moving in it, because through these small dry records we can see the actual lives of ordinary people who left no other trace: the weaver, the shepherd, the brewer, the messenger, people exactly as real as you, who woke and worked and were paid and went home and slept 4,000 years ago under the same moon that is very likely somewhere in your sky tonight. They worried about their debts, they celebrated their festivals, they named their children and grieved their dead and hoped for better years, and then the years turned, as years do, and the state that recorded them so carefully came, in its turn, to its end. The end of when it came, was remembered as a catastrophe so complete that the survivors composed a long lament over it, a poem of mourning for a fallen city, weeping that the good winds had been taken from the land, that the storms of the gods had come down upon that the bodies lay in the streets and the ziggurat stood silent, and the moon god had abandoned his own house and fled. Enemies came down from the eastern mountains, the same restless mountain peoples who haunt so much of this story, and they broke into the great city and carried off its king in chains to die a captive far from home, and for a time the light of the old Sumerian world truly did go out. But here is one of the deep and quiet truths of this whole long history, the thing that keeps it from being merely a sad procession of ruins, and it is this. The Sumerians, as a people speaking their strange, lonely language, faded away not long after this, absorbed into the larger population, their tongue slowly dying out of daily speech until it survived only as the sacred language of the temple. The ancient Latin of Mesopotamia, learned by scribes and chanted by priests but spoken at no one's dinner table ever again. And yet the Sumerians won. They lost their cities and their kingship and even their language, and still they won, because everyone who came after them, every people who would ever rule that land for the next 2,000 years, would build their cities on the Sumerian plan, and lift their temples in the Sumerian shape, and write their words in the Sumerian wedges, and count and measure and reckon the year by the Sumerian methods, and tell, as their own, the Sumerian stories of the flood and the hero and the gods. The Sumerians did not survive. But everything the Sumerians made survived, and was inherited and passed on, and is, in ways almost too deep to see. Still with us tonight, in the 60 minutes of your hour and the 60 seconds of your minute and the 360 degrees of the circle of the sky, all of them counted out first by patient Sumerian scribes under the great ziggurat of so long ago that the number of years between them and us is nearly the same as the number of years between them and the very first mud brick hut on. The empty plain. After the fall of the land broke once more into many pieces, and into that broken country came a new people, or rather a people who had been drifting in at the edges for a long time and now moved to the centre, herders and tribesmen from the western deserts and grasslands, whom the settled city folk called, a little sniffily, the Amorites, the Westerners. The people of the tent and the flock who did not know, the city people grumbled, how to bury their dead properly, or how to eat their grain like civilized men. It is a very old story, the tough-herding people from the margins who move into the rich settled land and are looked down upon by the city folk, and then, within a generation or two, become the city folk, and become their kings. And it happened here as it has happened again and again across the world, for the Amorites did not destroy the civilization of Mesopotamia. They married into it, they learned its ways, they took its gods and its writing and its love of order, and they set themselves up as the new lords of the old cities, and one of the small dusty cities they took for their own. A place of no particular importance in the older days, sitting on the Euphrates in the middle of the plain, was a town whose name would come to stand, for thousands of years, for the very idea of a great and wicked and dazzling city, and that town was Babylon. For a long time Babylon was nobody, one middling city among many, and its Amorite kings ruled their modest patch of fields and jostled with a dozen rival kingdoms for water and land and advantage in the endless game of the plain, and it might have stayed nobody forever, a name lost like 100 others, had it not been for the sixth of its kings, a patient, clever, long-lived, and utterly relentless man whose name has come down to us as Hammurabi. When Hammurabi came to the throne, Babylon was a small power hemmed in on every side by larger neighbours, and a lesser man might have spent his reign simply surviving. But Hammurabi was a lesser man in no way at all. He was, above everything, patient, and he understood, as the truly dangerous always do, how to wait. For the first decades of his long reign he did the quiet work, building the walls and the temples and the canals, keeping his treaties, biding his time, letting his rivals wear one another down in their own quarrels, and only when the moment was exactly right did he strike. And then he struck like the flood, swiftly and overwhelmingly, one great rival after another, playing them against each other, making an alliance and then turning on the ally the moment the ally had served his purpose, until by the end of his reign, the small hemmed-in city of Babylon ruled nearly the whole of Mesopotamia, north and south, from the Gulf toward the mountains, an empire to rival Sargon's, built by a man who had started with almost nothing but time and cunning and unbreakable will. But Hammurabi is not remembered, in the end chiefly for his conquests, which came apart soon enough after his death, as conquests do. He is remembered for a stone. Late in his reign he ordered the carving of a great pillar of hard black stone, taller than a man, and near the top of it he had an image cut, showing himself, the king, standing in reverence before the seated God of justice, the sun god who sees all things, receiving from the god the authority to rule and to judge. And below that image, running around and down the whole great stone in beautiful, careful, closely packed columns of cuneiform, he had carved a collection of laws, nearly 300 of them, the laws of his kingdom, set down in stone where every literate person could see them, and where the king declared they would stand forever, so that, in his own ringing words, the strong might not oppress the weak, and that justice might be done to the orphan and the widow, and that any wronged man might come and stand before the image of the King of Justice, and read, and take comfort, and know his rights. It is the most famous law code of the ancient world, far more famous than the older laws of and it is fascinating and troubling in equal measure, because it shows us a society trying with real seriousness to be just, and defining justice in ways that are sometimes strikingly modern and sometimes deeply strange to us. Here is the presumption that a man accused must be proven guilty. Here is the rule that a judge who changes his verdict after giving it shall be fined and removed from the bench forever, an ancient horror of corruption on the judgment seat. Here are careful protections for a wife whose husband is taken captive in war, and rules for what a man owes the widow, and limits on how long a debtor may be held in bondage. 3 years and then he goes free. An ancient mercy against endless debt. And here, too, is the famous and terrible principle that has echoed down the ages, that if a man destroys the eye of another man, his own eye shall be destroyed, and if he breaks another man's bone, his own bone shall be broken. An eye for an eye, and a bone for a bone. The law of exact retaliation, which strikes some who read it as brutal, and strikes others as, in its way, a kind of limit. A rule that says the punishment may match the crime, but may never exceed it. That for one eye you may take one eye, and never a life. And here, unmistakably, is a world of sharp and unequal ranks. For the same injury was punished very differently, depending on whether the victim was a nobleman, a commoner, or a slave, so that harming a great man cost you your matching part. But harming a poor man or a slave cost you only silver, and we should not pretty this over, because it was a hard and hierarchical world where a person's worth before the law depended heavily on the accident of their birth. And yet, and this is the thing to carry off into sleep, the very existence of the stone matters more than any single law upon it, because what Hammurabi was doing, in setting the law in public stone above the reach of any judge or official to alter, was declaring that the law stood over everyone, that even the powerful were bound by something written and fixed and knowable, that a wronged man could point to the stone and say, "Here, it is written, this is my right." And that idea, the idea that there is a law above the whim of the strong, an idea imperfectly reached for on that black pillar 4,000 years ago, is one of the deepest and most precious inheritances the whole human race has ever stumbled toward. And it was reached for first here, on the plain between the rivers, by a patient Amorite king who wanted, whatever else he wanted, to be remembered as just. Let us pause here in the warm middle of Hammurabi's Babylon and step down out of the palaces and the law courts and into the ordinary streets, because a civilization is not really its kings, it is its mornings, its meals, its markets, the small, unremarkable rounds of a life. And the people of Mesopotamia left us enough that we can walk those streets in the mind quite gently now as the evening comes down. A Babylonian house, for a family of some means, was built around a small open courtyard, its rooms turned inward away from the hot dusty lane, its walls of the same mud brick as everything else, thick enough to hold the cool of the night through the worst of the day's heat, its floors of packed earth or baked brick, its roof of reed and palm and mud where the family might sleep on the hottest nights under the stars. In the courtyard there would be a hearth, and jars of water and grain and beer, and the ordinary tools of living. The grinding stone where the day's flour was made by hand, the loom, the oven for the flat bread that was the heart of every meal. They ate barley in 100 forms, as bread and as porridge and above all as beer, a thick, nourishing, only lightly intoxicating beer that everyone drank, women and men and children alike, because it was safer than the river water, and full of the goodness of the grain, sipped in the earliest times through a long reed straw from a shared jar to leave the floating husks behind. They ate onions and garlic and leeks and beans and lentils, and dates by the endless basketful, for the date palm was the tree of life in that hot country, giving fruit and shade and wood and fibre and sweetness, and they ate fish from the rivers and the canals, and on good days and feast days the meat of sheep and goats, seasoned with the herbs and the sesame oil and the sour and salty flavours they loved. They kept their accounts and wrote their letters, and it is the letters, more than anything, that bring them close, because people wrote to each other constantly, on little clay tablets carried by messengers, and they wrote exactly the things we would write, a son far from home writing to his mother that the clothes she sends him are never as fine as the clothes other men's mothers send, and could she please do better, a merchant complaining bitterly that the copper he was sold was of poor quality, and that he has been treated with contempt and will not stand for it. A man writing to another about a debt, about a marriage, about a shared field, about a quarrel, about the small endless business of being alive among other people. They fell in love and married, with contracts and dowries and the careful involvement of both families, and they divorced, which the law allowed, though far more easily for the husband than the wife, as in so much of the ancient world. They fell ill and turned to healers of two kinds who worked side by side without any sense of contradiction. the one who treated the body with herbs and poultices and bandages, and a real and growing store of practical medical knowledge, and the one who treated the unseen causes with prayers and incantations and small rituals to drive out the demon or lift the curse that had, they believed, brought the sickness on. They looked up constantly at the sky, because the sky was where the gods wrote their intentions. And out of that patient, anxious, endless watching of the heavens, the search for omens in the movements of the moon and the planets, grew something that long outlived the fear that started it. Real astronomy, careful records of the risings and settings and wanderings of the stars kept night after. Night for centuries, until the priest astronomers of Babylon could predict the movements of the moon and the planets with a precision that still astonishes, and could foretell an eclipse, and had mapped the band of the sky through which the sun and moon and planets move into the 12 signs we still, to this very day, read in the newspaper, the signs of the zodiac, born on those flat rooftops under those enormous ancient skies. And they slept, of course, as we are preparing to sleep, and they dreamed, and they took their dreams seriously, and kept long lists of what dreams might mean, and lay down at the end of their days as tired and as hopeful and as ready for rest as you are now. All of this, the beer and the bread and the letters and the loom and the watched stars, this was the deep, warm, ordinary body of the civilization, and it went on quietly beneath every rise and fall of every king, for it is far harder to end a way of life than to end a dynasty. But the dynasties did end, and Hammurabi's did, and it ended in a way that would become almost a signature of this land, not with a slow decay, but with a sudden blow from an unexpected direction. His son and his grandsons held the empire together for a while, and then, as always, less well, losing the south, losing the edges, shrinking back toward Babylon itself, until a century and a half after Hammurabi's death, out of the mountains and plateaus of the far northwest, from a people the Babylonians barely knew, came a raid of astonishing daring, a king of the Hittites marching his army an enormous distance down the length of the land, further than anyone from that quarter had ever come, all the way to Babylon itself, and taking the great city, and sacking it, and carrying off its treasures, and even the statue of its chief god. And then, strangely, simply leaving, marching all the way home again with the plunder, having come, it seems, not to rule but only to raid, to prove it could be done, to strike the greatest city in the world and vanish back into the mountains before anyone could answer. And with that blow the age of Hammurabi's Babylon was over, and there followed one of those long, dim, quiet stretches that every ancient history has, and that historians, a little wistfully, tend to call a dark age, not because it was necessarily a time of misery, but because it is a time from which few written records survive, so that the lamp of our knowledge burns low, and we see the land only in glimpses. Into the quiet came yet another people from the mountains, the Kassites, who took Babylon and ruled it. And ruled it, by all the signs, well and peacefully for a very long time, 4 centuries or more, longer than any native dynasty ever managed. And yet we know them so poorly, precisely because those centuries were calm, that they remain shadows, good grey kings who kept the temple standing and the canals dredged and the old ways alive through a hard age, and asked, it seems, for nothing more from history than to be left in peace, which history, being what it is, was never going to grant for long. Before we follow the story north, into the harder country where the next great power was gathering, let us sit for a little while with the gods of Mesopotamia, because to understand these people at all, we must understand that they lived every hour of every day inside a world that was crowded, utterly, with the divine. There was no corner of their life that a god did not touch. The great gods were the great forces of the world made into persons, the god of the sky, calm and remote and highest of all, the god of the air and the storm, powerful and dangerous, the goddess of the sweet fresh water that welled up from beneath the earth and made the fields green, the god of the moon who measured out the months, the god of the sun who saw all things and judged all things and could hide nothing, and above all, for the ordinary passionate business of human life, the great goddess of love and war both at once, fierce and beautiful and terrible, worshipped across the whole land under many names across the centuries, the morning and evening star, the one who could make a man fall in love, and make two armies fall upon each other with equal delight. And below the great gods there were gods for everything, for the plough and the brick and the grain and the beer, for each city and each gate and each family. And personal gods, little household gods, a god and goddess who watched over you in particular, your own, whom you fed and honoured, and who stood, you hoped, between you and the vast indifference of the greater powers, so that when misfortune came, when you fell sick or lost your money or your child, the first anxious question was always, what have I done? How have I offended? Why has my God turned away and left me open to the demons that are always waiting at the edge of the light? For it was, in truth, an anxious faith, and we should be honest about that as the night deepens, because there was not much comfort of the warm and reassuring kind in it. The Mesopotamians did not believe, as far as we can tell, in a bright and happy life after death, waiting to reward the good. They believed instead in a grey place below the earth, a house of dust to which all the dead went down alike, king and slave, good and wicked, a dim land where the shades sat in the dark and ate dry clay and drank muddy water and remembered, faintly, the light. It was not a place of torment, but it was not a place of joy either. It was simply the end, the going down, the long grey afterward, and the best that could be hoped for it was that your children would remember you, and say your name, and pour out water for your thirsty shade, and keep you from being utterly forgotten, which is why to be left unburied, or to leave no children to tend your memory, was one of the worst fates these people could imagine. And knowing this, that they expected no paradise, that they looked forward past death into only that grey and dusty quiet, changes how we hear everything else about them, because it means that all their striving, all their building and writing and law-making and star-watching, all of it was for here, for now, for this life, the only bright life they thought they would ever have. The whole point, for them, was to live well and justly and fully in the short, warm span of days between the two darknesses, to eat their bread and drink their beer and love their families and do their work and leave something behind. And there is, when you sit with it, something clean and brave, and even beautiful in that. A people who expected nothing from the beyond and so poured everything into the now. Who built a civilization that has lasted, in its gifts, 5,000 years. Not because they were promised a reward for it, but simply because the work was good, and the day was bright, and the building was worth doing. They understood, too, that they had not made themselves, that they lived by the sufferance of powers far greater than they were, and their oldest stories say that human beings were fashioned out of clay, out of the very river mud they built everything else from, and given the breath of life, and set to work, in the beginning, to do the labour the gods did not wish to do themselves, to dig the canals and tend the fields and feed the gods with offerings, so that the whole of civilization was, in a sense, understood as a great household in which humankind kept house for heaven. It is a humbler vision of ourselves than we are used to, the human being as the servant made of mud, and yet it carried within it a strange dignity, because it meant that the work mattered, that the tending of the earth and the keeping of the order and the feeding of the divine were not small things but the very reason the human race existed, and that a person who did their work faithfully, who kept the canals clear and the law straight and the offerings pure, was doing exactly what they had been made to do, and could lie down at the end of the day, and at the end of the life having done it. And so they lit their lamps, and made their small offerings, and told their children the old stories of the flood and the making of the world, and watched the stars wheel over the flat black plain, and were afraid sometimes, as all people are afraid in the dark, of the demons and the anger of the gods and the grey house waiting below, and were comforted too, as all people are comforted, by the warmth of the family and the fullness of the granary and the steadiness of the returning seasons, and in all of this. Across 5,000 years and a strange dead language and a vanished world of temple mountains and clay tablets, they were, we find, so very like us, so entirely and recognizably human, that to learn about them is not really to learn about strangers at all, but to meet, in the deep past, the first people who lived the way we live, in cities, under laws, among letters and stars and gods, and who lay down at night as you are lying down now, and closed their eyes, and let the long day go, and slept. Now we must travel north up the length of the plain, away from the soft marshy south with its reed boats and its ancient cities, into a harder and higher country where the Tigris runs faster, and the winters bite, and the land rolls up toward the mountains, because it was here. Around an old city that took its name from its god, the city and the god both called Ashur, that the last and the mightiest and the most terrible of the great Mesopotamian empires slowly gathered its strength. The people of this northern country spoke the same tongue as the Babylonians, worshipped mostly the same gods, wrote the same wedges, inherited the same long civilization, and yet they became, over the centuries, a different kind of people, shaped by a different land. For the north was a borderland exposed on every side, without the great protecting marshes of the south, open to raiders from the mountains and the steppes, a place where a city had to fight to survive or not survive at all. And out of that hard schooling the Assyrians made themselves into the most formidable military power the ancient world had yet seen, a people organized to a degree the world had never witnessed, around the making of war. For a long time Assyria was only a small kingdom, sometimes independent and proud, sometimes swallowed up by stronger neighbours and biding its time. A merchant city as much as a military one in its early days, sending long caravans of donkeys laden with tin and fine cloth up into the mountains to trade for silver, its patient traders keeping careful records that let us read their worried, hopeful, homesick letters across 4,000 years. But slowly, reign by reign, the kings of Ashur grew stronger and pushed their borders outward, and learned and remembered that safety in that exposed land lay not in walls alone, but in armies, in reaching out and striking the enemy before the enemy could strike them, in making the lands around them fear the name of Ashur so deeply that they would not dare to move. And when at last, after many centuries of rising and falling, the full power of Assyria was unleashed upon the world, it came in a form that made the peoples of the whole region tremble, because the Assyrians had built something new under the sun, a true war machine, a state organized from top to bottom for conquest, and they were very, very good at it. Their army was the terror of the age. They had disciplined masses of spearmen and archers, and they had cavalry, riders on horseback, still a relatively new and frightening thing, and above all they had the engineering genius of siege warfare raised to a high and merciless art, so that a walled city, which for most of history had been a nearly safe refuge, was no longer safe at all when the Assyrians came. For they came with great siege engines and battering rams roofed against fire and arrows, and they built ramps of earth up against the walls, and they undermined the foundations, and they were patient and thorough and unstoppable. And city after city that had thought itself secure behind its ramparts learned, to its horror, that the walls would not save it. And when a city that had defied them fell, the Assyrians did a terrible thing, quite deliberately as policy, which was to make an example of it so ghastly that the next city would think very hard before defying them at all. They recorded these things themselves boastfully in their royal inscriptions and carved them in stone on the walls of their palaces. The burning and the slaughter and the flaying and the impaling and the heaping up of the bodies, the deliberate and calculated use of horror as a tool of statecraft, terror made into a weapon as surely as the spear and the ram, so that the reputation of Assyrian cruelty marched ahead of the Assyrian army and did half its work before a single arrow was loosed. We should not turn away from this, though it sits hard against the calm of the night, because it is the truth of what they were, and it is part of why their empire, for all its glittering achievements, was hated as few powers in history have been hated, and why when it finally fell, the whole world that had suffered under it rejoiced. And yet, and this is the strange doubleness of Assyria that makes it so unforgettable, This same brutal war state was also one of the great patrons of civilization the ancient world produced, a builder of magnificent cities and breathtaking art, and in the end, of the greatest library the world had yet known. The Assyrian kings poured the plunder of their conquests into building, raising vast new capitals out of the northern plain, and they lined the walls of their sprawling palaces with carved stone panels, mile upon mile of them, showing the king at the hunt and the king at war, and the king before the gods. And these carvings are among the supreme masterpieces of ancient art, so alive, so detailed, so charged with movement and feeling, that to stand before them now, in the great museums where many of them have come to rest, is to feel the breath of that vanished world on your face. There is one series of these carvings, made for one of the last great kings, showing a royal lion hunt. And in it, among the roaring and the chariots and the arrows, there is a single carved lioness, wounded, dragging her paralyzed hind legs, lifting her head to roar in her pain and her defiance, and it is rendered with such tenderness, such unbearable sympathy for the dying animal, that people stand before it in silence 3,000 years later, with tears in their eyes, and wonder how the same hands, the same court, the same civilization that could carve a suffering creature with such compassion, could also flay its human enemies, alive and boast of it on the neighbouring wall. That contradiction is Assyria, and there is no resolving it, only holding it, the beauty and the horror side by side, cut in the same stone by the same patient chisels. A reminder as old as civilization itself that the capacity to make great beauty and the capacity to do great cruelty have always uncomfortably lived in the same human heart. At its height in the last few centuries before the birth of Christ, the empire of Assyria grew until it was the largest the world had ever seen, larger than Sargon's, larger than Hammurabi's, stretching at its greatest from the mountains of the east clear across to the shore of the great western sea, and reaching, for a time, even down into the ancient land of Egypt itself, so that a single king ruling from the northern plain of Mesopotamia commanded, at least in name, nearly the whole of the civilized world as the peoples of that region knew it. This was achieved by a line of remarkable and ruthless kings, and one of them in particular reshaped the empire from something that merely conquered into something that could truly hold what it conquered. For he understood that raiding a land and marching home again, as the old kings had done, gathered plunder but built nothing lasting, and so he set about turning conquest into administration, carving the empire into provinces with governors who answered directly to him, building roads and a system of swift royal messengers so that word could travel across the vast empire faster than ever before, and standing up a professional standing army paid and equipped by the state, rather than a seasonal levy of farmers. And he adopted, on a massive and systematic scale, the policy for which Assyria became both effective and infamous, the mass deportation of conquered peoples, the uprooting of whole populations from their rebellious homelands, and their resettlement, hundreds of miles away, among strangers, in some distant corner of the empire, where, cut off from their land and their kin and their old rallying cries, they could not easily rebel, and would, over generations, melt into the general population of the empire and become simply Assyrians, subjects like any other. Millions of people over the centuries were moved this way, entire nations picked up and set down elsewhere, and it was a cruelty on a scale that is hard to take in. Families and communities and ways of life dissolved by imperial decree, and it was also, in its cold way, effective, and it left marks on the history of the world that have never faded. For it was in one of these great deportations that one of the two kingdoms of the ancient Hebrews was carried away and scattered and lost to history, remembered ever after only as the lost tribes, vanished into the vast machinery of the Assyrian resettlement, never to return. The Assyrian kings built and rebuilt their capitals with the wealth of the world flowing in, and the last and greatest of these capitals was Nineveh, on the eastern bank of the Tigris, which one of the last great kings raised into an enormous and magnificent city, ringed by miles of massive walls pierced by great gates, watered by an ingenious system of canals, and even an aqueduct that carried fresh water to the city and its gardens from the hills many miles away. A feat of engineering built of more than 1 million dressed stones, so that the desert city bloomed with orchards and parks and gardens planted with trees and plants gathered from every land the empire had conquered. And at the very end of the empire's greatness there sat upon the throne of Nineveh a king unlike any who had come before him, a king who was, by his own proud account, not only a mighty hunter and a terrible warrior, but a scholar, a man who had been taught in his youth to read and to write the difficult ancient wedges, who could, he boasted, read the most obscure and difficult tablets, the ones written in the old dead Sumerian tongue that even the priests found hard, who understood the secret law of the heavens and the earth, and who conceived, out of this rare royal love of learning, one of the most magnificent projects in the whole history of the human mind. He resolved to gather, into his palace at Nineveh, a copy of every worthwhile piece of writing in the whole of Mesopotamia, all the accumulated knowledge and literature and wisdom of that ancient civilization, more than 2,000 years of it, and to house it all in one place, ordered and catalogued, for the use of the king and the preservation of the learning. He sent his scribes and his agents out across the land, to the old temples and the ancient cities of the south, to Babylon and Uruk and the rest, to seek out and copy or seize the tablets, the myths and the epics and the hymns and the prayers, the medical texts and the astronomical records, the omen collections and the word lists, and the mathematical tables and the law codes and the histories, and to bring them all to Nineveh, and there they were copied out and arranged and stored. Tens of thousands of tablets, the first great systematically collected library in the history of the world. And here the wheel of this story turns in a way so beautiful, so unlikely, that if it were invented no one would believe it, because that library, gathered by that scholar king in his doomed and hated empire in its last bright years, was buried when the empire fell, buried under the burned and shattered ruin of Nineveh, and it lay there in the ground, forgotten utterly, for 2,500 years, and then it was dug up again. In modern times, tens of thousands of clay tablets baked hard and preserved by the very fire that destroyed the city that housed them, and it is from that library, more than from any other single source, that we have recovered the lost voice of Mesopotamia, the epic of the hero and his journey against death, the story of the flood. The myths of the making of the world, the hymns and the laments, and the wisdom of a civilization that had been silent for so long that its very existence had been half forgotten. The proud scholar king wanted his learning preserved forever. He could not have dreamed the manner in which his wish would be granted, that his empire would be blotted from the earth and his gathered wisdom sealed in fire and darkness for 2,500 years, and then given back, whole to a world he could not imagine, so that a person lying in the dark 5,000 miles and 5,000 years away might hear, tonight, the very stories his scribes pressed into clay. But that is exactly what happened, and it is, perhaps, the single most perfect illustration this whole long history offers of its own deepest lesson, that everything ends, and still some things remain, and that what remains is so often not the thing the mighty fought and killed and boasted to preserve, the empire, the conquest, the terror, but the quiet thing, the written word, the story, the small clay tablet that outlasts the throne. The empire of Assyria, at the very moment of its greatest reach, was already, though no one could quite see it, overstretched and hollow at the core, and this too is one of the oldest patterns in the story of empires, that the moment of greatest size is so often the moment just before the fall, because an empire that has conquered everything within reach has also by then made enemies of everyone within reach, and has stretched its armies and its treasury and its aging soldiers thin across an impossible distance, and has ruled so long by terror that the whole world is only waiting, holding its breath, for the first sign of weakness. And the first sign of weakness, when it came to Assyria, came in the way it so often comes, from within, from a quarrel over the throne. The great scholar king who built the library grew old, and when such a king dies, the question of who shall rule after him has a way of tearing a state apart, and Assyria, in its last years, was weakened by exactly such struggles, by civil war among those who would be king, at the very time when its subject peoples, sensing that the terrible hand was loosening at last, began to stir. Away to the south, Babylon, the ancient and proud and endlessly rebellious city, which had chafed under Assyrian rule for centuries, and had risen and been crushed and risen again more times than anyone could count, found at last a leader clever and patient enough to make the rebellion stick, a Babylonian king who threw off the Assyrian yoke and declared his city free. And away to the east, in the mountains and high plains of the land we now call, by the name of the people who lived there, the Medes, a new and vigorous power was rising, a kingdom of horsemen and warriors who had their own long list of grievances against Assyria and their own hunger to see the hated empire brought down. And these two, the freed Babylonians of the south and the rising Medes of the east, ancient enemies of Assyria both, did the thing that Assyria had spent centuries making sure its enemies could never do. They made an alliance. They joined their strength together, and they turned as one upon the empire that had terrorized them for so long. What followed was one of the great reckonings of ancient history, a settling of accounts centuries in the making, and it was swift, and it was total, and it was, by every sign we have, merciless in the exact measure that Assyria's own cruelty had earned. The allied armies fell upon the Assyrian heartland and took its cities one after another, and then they came to Nineveh itself, the great capital, the largest and most magnificent city in the world, ringed by its miles of massive walls, and they laid siege to it. The city held for a time as great cities do, but the end was not in doubt, and there is an old tradition, which may hold a grain of truth, that in the final days even the river turned against the city, that unusually heavy rains swelled the Tigris and its tributaries until the floodwaters undermined and broke a stretch of the great walls, so that the very rivers that had made Mesopotamia, the rivers that had watered its fields and floated its boats and fed its people for 3,000 years, delivered the final blow to the proudest city those rivers had ever raised. The attackers poured through the breach, and Nineveh fell, and it was sacked and burned and thrown down with a thoroughness that speaks of a hatred beyond ordinary war, its palaces put to the torch, its temples pulled down, its people killed or scattered, its very name, for a time, seemingly meant to be erased from the earth, and the destruction was so complete, so final, that within a lifetime or two the site of Nineveh, that vast and glittering capital of the greatest empire the world had yet known, had become a nameless mound of earth and rubble, and the grass grew over it, and the shepherds grazed their flocks upon it, without the least idea of what lay beneath their feet. And travellers passed the great mounds along the river, and did not know that they were walking beside the buried bones of Nineveh, and the empire of Assyria passed so wholly out of the living memory of the world that in later centuries people began to doubt whether it had ever truly existed at all, whether the tales of the mighty Assyrian conquerors were anything more than legend. And it would be. As with the library, more than 2,000 years before the spades of modern explorers cut into those grassy mounds along the Tigris and struck, to their astonishment, the carved stone walls of buried palaces and the roaring stone lions and the tens of thousands of tablets, and gave back to the world an empire it had forgotten it ever had. The prophets and the poets of the ancient world, who had trembled under Assyria's shadow for so long, greeted its fall with a kind of savage joy that still burns off the page, and the deepest note in all that rejoicing was not merely triumph, but a kind of awe, a wonder at how the mightiest thing in the world could become, so quickly and so completely, nothing at all, how the great city that had gathered the wealth and the terror of the nations could become a haunt of the wild beasts and a place where the flocks lay down, how everything that Assyria had been, all its armies and its palaces and its carved reliefs and its boasting inscriptions, had come, in the end, to silence and grass, and a low green mound beside a slow brown river under an enormous and indifferent sky. Let that be tonight, not a frightening thought, but a peaceful one. The most terrible power the ancient world had ever known rose, and reached across the whole earth, and was hated, and fell, and was forgotten, and the rivers went on exactly as before, unhurried, unbothered, carrying their silt down to the sea as they had before there was an Assyria, and as they do tonight, and the whole vast drama of that empire, all its centuries of conquest and cruelty and splendour, is now only a story we tell in the dark to help us fall asleep, which is, when you think about it kindly, a gentle enough end for anything to come to. With Assyria thrown down, the ancient city of Babylon, freed at last after centuries under the northern yoke, rose to a final and dazzling greatness, the last flowering of the native Mesopotamian world before it passed forever under foreign rule, and this last age is often called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the New Babylonian Empire, though there was nothing new about Babylon, which by then had already stood for well over 1,000 years, and was one of the oldest inhabited cities on the earth. The king who had led the rebellion against Assyria passed his throne to his son, and that son became the most famous king in the whole long history of Mesopotamia, a name that has echoed down through scripture and legend and song for 2,500 years, Nebuchadnezzar, and under him Babylon became, for a few glittering decades, the greatest and richest and most magnificent city on the face of the earth, the wonder of the ancient world, the city that later ages would remember, with a mixture of awe and horror as the very symbol of earthly power and earthly pride. Nebuchadnezzar was a conqueror in the old mould, and he marched his armies west, into the lands along the Mediterranean coast, and it was there that his reign collided with the small kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem, in an episode that would give him a place in the memory of half the world forever after. Judah rebelled against Babylonian overlordship, and Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged Jerusalem and took it, and when it rebelled again, he came again, and this time destroyed it utterly, threw down its walls and burned its great temple, the Temple of Solomon, the holiest place of the Hebrew people, and carried off the leaders and the craftsmen and the priests and much of the population into captivity in Babylon. In the event remembered ever after, with tears as the Babylonian exile, the long weeping years by the rivers of Babylon, where the captives hung their harps upon the willows and could not sing the songs of their lost home in a strange land. That exile, that catastrophe, would prove to be one of the great turning points in the history of religion, for it was in Babylon, in exile, cut off from their temple and their land, that the scattered people of Judah gathered and preserved and set down their scriptures and their law with a new and desperate seriousness, so that their faith, which might have died with their kingdom as so many others died, instead deepened and endured, and became something that could survive without a temple or a land at all, and went on to reshape the spiritual history of the entire world. And so Babylon, in trying to crush a small stubborn people, instead forged them. And the memory of Babylon, the destroyer, Babylon, the golden city of captivity and pride, was burned so deep into the scriptures of that people, and of the faiths that would descend from them, that the name of Babylon has stood, ever since, in the imagination of a large part of humanity, for the great and glittering and doomed city of this world, the whore of gold and the tower of pride, fated always to fall. But we should see the real city too, the actual Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, because it was, by every account that survives, genuinely one of the most astonishing things human beings had ever built. The king poured the plunder and the tribute of his empire into rebuilding it on a scale of staggering magnificence. He raised great double walls around it so broad. The later Greek travellers claimed in wonder that a 4-horse chariot could turn around upon their top, walls so vast that Babylon was reckoned among the mightiest fortresses in the world. He rebuilt the great processional way that ran through the heart of the city, paved it with stone, and lined it with high walls faced in brilliant glazed brick of a deep lapis blue, and set into that shining blue, in rows, the moulded golden figures of lions, sacred to the great goddess, striding along beside the worshippers as they walked, and at the end of the processional way he raised the most beautiful of all the city's structures, a great gate dedicated to the goddess, faced entirely in that same glowing blue glazed brick, and decorated with rows upon rows of moulded dragons and bulls in gold and white, so that to pass through the Ishtar Gate into Babylon was to walk into a blaze of blue and gold unlike anything else in the world, and a part of that gate, dug up and carried away and painstakingly rebuilt, still stands today in a museum far to the north, still blue, still glowing, so that you can walk through it even now and feel, for a moment, what it was to enter Babylon at the height of its glory. At the centre of the city rose the great temple of its chief god, and beside it the enormous ziggurat, the temple mountain of Babylon, rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar to a tremendous height, its name in the old tongue meaning something like the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth, a stepped tower climbing stage upon stage toward the sky, crowned with a shrine of the god. And it is this tremendous tower, this most famous of all the ziggurats, that is remembered in the old story of the tower that men built to reach heaven and that was thrown into confusion, the Tower of Babel, so that even the human dream of building all the way up to the sky, and the humbling of that dream, comes down to us wearing the name of Babylon. And around all this splendour there clings the most famous legend of all, the story of the Hanging Gardens, the green and terraced gardens said to have been planted high upon the walls or the terraces of the palace, rising in tiers of trees and flowers and falling water, a mountain of greenery in the flat brown plain, which the later Greeks numbered among the 7 wonders of the world, and which they said Nebuchadnezzar built to comfort his queen, who came from a green and mountainous land and pined, amid the dust of Babylon, for the forests of her home, so that the king, for love of her, is said to have raised a whole artificial mountain of gardens, watered by some ingenious hidden machinery lifting the river up to the heights, so that she might climb it and walk among the trees and remember, and be a little less homesick in the strange flat golden city that was now her home. Whether the Hanging Gardens were truly at Babylon, or whether the Greeks confused them with the great watered gardens of Assyrian Nineveh, the scholars still gently argue, and we need not settle it tonight, for the story itself is what has lasted. The image of the green gardens hanging in the air above the golden city, one of the loveliest pictures the ancient world ever left us, and a fitting emblem for Babylon at its height, a city so rich and so proud and so dazzling that it could raise even a mountain and a forest out of the bare mud of the plain, for love or for glory, or simply because it could. But Babylon at its height was also Babylon near its end, and the golden city had less time left than any of its people, walking the blue processional way beneath the striding golden lions, could possibly have guessed. Nebuchadnezzar reigned long and died old and full of glory, and after him, as so often, the line faltered, kings following kings in quick and troubled succession, murdered and replaced, until the throne came at last to a man named Nabonidus, who was in many ways the strangest king ever to rule Babylon, a scholar and an antiquarian who loved the old past even of that ancient land, who dug down into the ruins of temples thousands of years old to find the foundation stones of vanished kings and read their names, so that he has been called, with some justice, the first archaeologist in history, a king who went looking, in the deep past, for exactly the kind of thing we are looking for tonight. But Nabonidus was also a king strangely out of step with his own people, for he neglected the great chief god of Babylon, and lavished his devotion instead upon the moon god of a distant northern city, and, most bafflingly of all, he left Babylon itself for years on end, and went to live far away in the deserts of the south, leaving the affairs of the capital, and the crucial yearly festival of the chief god upon which the whole spiritual life of the city was thought to depend, in the hands of his son, who ruled in Babylon in his father's long absence, a prince whose name comes down to us as Belshazzar. And it was in the reign of this absent king and his son the regent that the shadow fell, from the east, as it so often did, from beyond the mountains, in the shape of the swiftest and most brilliant conqueror the ancient world had yet produced, a king of the Persians named Cyrus, who in a single astonishing generation had risen from the ruler of a small mountain people to the master of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, gathering the Medes and the Lydians and land after land into his hand, an empire that now stretched around and above Babylon on every side, so that the golden city, for all its mighty walls, stood alone and surrounded, the last great prize, the last free thing, waiting. The old scripture tells the fall of Babylon as a single unforgettable night, the night of Belshazzar's feast, when the prince, it is said, held a great banquet for 1,000 of his lords, and in his pride called for the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had carried off from the temple in Jerusalem, and drank wine from them, and praised the gods of gold and silver. And in the midst of the revelry a hand appeared, a hand with no body, and wrote upon the plaster of the palace wall 4 strange words that no one in the hall could read, until the old prophet of the captives was brought in, and read them, and told the terrified prince their meaning, that his days were numbered and his kingdom weighed and found wanting and given to the Medes and the Persians. And that very night, the story says, the city fell and the prince was slain, so that the writing on the wall has passed into the speech of half the world as the very name for a doom that is coming and cannot be stopped. And the sober records, in their quieter way, agree that the fall was swift and strangely bloodless, that Cyrus and his army came, and that Babylon, the mightiest fortress in the world, with its double walls broad enough to turn a chariot upon, fell almost without a fight, in a single season, perhaps betrayed from within by priests and people alienated by the strange, neglectful king, perhaps taken by a bold stroke. For there was an old tale, told by the Greek travellers, that the Persians diverted the great river that ran through the heart of the city and marched their soldiers in along the drained riverbed, under the walls, in the dark, while the city feasted, so that once again, as at Nineveh, it was the river, the ancient river, the maker and the mover of everything, that let the enemy in at the last. However it truly happened, the great city was taken, and the last native king of Mesopotamia was deposed, and Cyrus the Persian walked into Babylon as its master, and there upon the throne of Nebuchadnezzar ended, quietly, without a great battle, without a burning, something far larger than a single reign, for the fall of Babylon that night was the end of native Mesopotamian kingship forever. The end of the 3,000-year line of kings that ran all the way back through Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians and Hammurabi and the kings of Ur and Sargon of Akkad to the first shadowy rulers of Uruk in the mist at the very beginning of history. The end of the whole long age in which the land between the rivers had ruled itself and led the world. Never again would Mesopotamia be the centre of its own story. From that night on it would be a province, a rich and ancient and honoured province, but a province still, ruled from elsewhere, first by the Persians, and then, 2 centuries later, by the young Macedonian conqueror who swept out of the west and took the whole Persian world in a handful of years, and who, when he saw Babylon, loved it, and meant to make it the capital of his own New World empire, and who then died there, young, of a fever, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, so that Babylon was, in a strange bracketing of history, both very nearly the capital of the world once more, and in the same moment, the place where that last great dream came to nothing. And now, in the quiet, let us go back, all the way back, to where we began this long night, to that flat and empty plain at the end of a summer day, with the 2 slow rivers moving through it, and the reeds whispering, and the few thin threads of smoke rising from the first small fires, before there were any cities, or kings, or walls, or gods lifted up on mountains of brick, when there was only the mud and the water, and a handful of people who had decided, for reasons they could not have explained, to stay. Everything we have walked through tonight, all of it, the first city and the first writing, and the first empire and the first laws, Gilgamesh and Sargon and Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, the ziggurats and the libraries and the golden gates and the hanging gardens, the whole vast 3,000-year procession of glory and cruelty and beauty and loss, all of it grew from that one small quiet fire on that one empty plain, from that one basket of grain that a nameless person set aside because there was more than the family could eat that night. That is where it started. And now it is over, and the plain is empty again, or nearly so, only low green mounds where the great cities stood, and the same 2 rivers moving through it, unhurried, unbothered, exactly as they moved before any of it began. The going out of a civilization is rarely a single moment, rarely a wall thrown down or a king slain in a night, however much the old stories love to tell it that way. Far more often it is a slow fading, a thing that happens so gradually that no one alive ever wakes to find that it has happened. And this is how the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia truly came, at last, to its end, not with the fall of Babylon to Cyrus. For the cities went on, the temples went on, the scribes went on, pressing their wedges into clay, but with a long, soft, centuries deep dimming, like an evening that does not seem to be getting darker until, quite suddenly, you realize you can no longer read the page in your hand. Under the Persians, Babylon remained one of the great cities of the world, honored, wealthy, ancient beyond the reckoning of its rulers, and its priests still watched the stars and kept the festivals and copied out the old tablets. Under the young conqueror from the west and the kings who divided his empire after his early death, the land was ruled from new Greek-speaking cities, and a new tongue and a new way of life spread across the old plain, and slowly, the ancient ways began to belong only to the temples, to the old priesthoods clustered around the great shrines, keeping alive, out of piety and habit, the immense inheritance of their ancestors even as the world around them forgot it. The old languages faded from the streets first, replaced by the common speech of the age, and then faded from ordinary writing, and survived at last only in the temples as sacred and scholarly tongues learned by a shrinking handful of priests the way a dead language is learned, until even that thin thread wore away. And there is, in the museums of the world, a particular and haunting object, a single clay tablet covered in the careful wedge writing that had carried the thought of that civilization for more than 3,000 years, and it is an astronomical text, a record of the positions of the planets, made by the temple star watchers of Babylon, and it is dated, by their own reckoning, to a year that falls not long before the birth of Christ, and as far as anyone has yet found, it is the last of them, the youngest cuneiform tablet in the world, the final entry in a written record that had run unbroken for 3,000 years. The last time, so far as we know, that any human hand pressed a reed into clay in that ancient script and meant something by it. Think of that, gently, in the dark. Think of the last scribe, some old priest in a crumbling temple in a city that was already a living ruin, one of the very few people left in all the world who could still read the old signs, pressing out the positions of the planets by habit and by faith, keeping the record his fathers had kept for 100 generations, not knowing, having no way to know, that he was the last, that after him the long conversation would fall silent, that the wedges he was making would be the final wedges, that a script which had recorded the first laws and the first stories and the first accounts of the human race was in his tired and faithful hand coming quietly to its end. He did not know he was closing a door that had stood open for 3,000 years. He simply finished his tablet and set it aside to dry and went home, and the door swung shut behind him so softly that no one heard it close. And then the silence came, and it was very deep, and it was very long. The temples fell into ruin, and the mud brick, unmaintained, did what mud brick always does, softened in the rare rains and slumped and dissolved and returned, over the centuries, to the mud it had been made from, so that the great buildings melted slowly back into the earth, and the wind blew the dust of them across the plain, and the mounds grew rounder and lower and greener, and grass and scrub covered them, and the people who came after, who herded their flocks across those long low hills, had no idea and no way of knowing that beneath the grass under their feet lay the palaces of Nineveh and the temples of Ur and the Golden Gate of Babylon, and tens upon tens of thousands of tablets carrying the entire memory of the first civilization on earth. The names lingered, some of them in scripture and in legend, Babylon and Nineveh, but they had become words of warning, symbols of pride and doom, cities of the imagination, and it was widely doubted whether they had ever been real places at all, or whether Assyria and its conquerors were anything more than the tall tales of the ancients, and the whole vast, intricate, 3,000-year reality of Mesopotamian civilization, the cities and the kings and the laws and the libraries, sank so far beneath the surface of the world's memory that for the better part of 2,000 years it was, for all practical purposes, simply gone. Not misremembered, not distorted, but gone, erased, forgotten as completely as if it had never happened at all. Waiting under the grass, under the dust, under the low green mounds beside the two slow rivers, in a silence that would last until men with spades and an almost unreasonable curiosity came, in a far-off age it could never have imagined, to wake it. The waking, when it came at last, came in the way that so many of the great recoveries of the lost past have come, through a mixture of curiosity and stubbornness and a little luck, and it is one of the loveliest chapters in this whole story, because it is the chapter in which the silence ends, in which the forgotten begins, after 2,000 years, to speak again. For a long time, travellers passing through that country had noticed the great mounds rising out of the flat plain, too regular, too many, to be natural hills, and had wondered about them, and some had guessed, correctly, that they were the graves of ancient cities, and picked up from their slopes the odd baked brick stamped with mysterious wedge-shaped marks, or the odd broken cylinder of clay covered in the same strange writing, and carried these curiosities home to the great cities of Europe, where they sat in cabinets and collections, admired, puzzled over, entirely unreadable, for no living person on earth could make the least sense of the wedges. No one had been able to read that script for the better part of 2 millennia. The knowledge had died with the last scribe and been buried with the last tablet. And then, in the great age of exploration and excavation, men began, in earnest, to dig. They drove their trenches into the huge mounds along the Tigris and the Euphrates, not always gently, not always wisely by the careful standards we would use now, but with an energy and a wonder that is hard not to admire. And what they found astonished the whole world. Out of the mound across the river from a small modern town came the vast buried palaces of the Assyrian kings, their walls still lined with the great carved stone reliefs, the winged bulls with human heads, huge as houses, that had guarded the ancient gates, the roaring lions, the marching armies, the besieged cities, the king at his hunt, all of it emerging from the earth after 25 centuries into the light of a new age, and the enormous sculptures were dug out and crated and floated down the rivers on rafts and shipped across the sea to the great museums of Europe, where crowds gathered, amazed, to look upon the face of a civilization that Scripture had named, but that no one had ever truly seen. And beneath the palaces, in room after buried room, the diggers found the tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, the scattered remains of the great library of the scholar king, the omens and the hymns and the epics and the word lists, all in the maddening, unreadable wedges. And now, suddenly, there was a reason more urgent than mere curiosity to crack the code. Because everyone understood that these tablets, if they could ever be read, would give back the very voice, the actual words and thoughts of the lost world. The cracking of that code, the decipherment of cuneiform, is one of the great intellectual detective stories in the history of the human mind, a labour of decades by a handful of brilliant and obsessive scholars, working, at first from a single extraordinary clue, a great inscription carved high on a cliff face in 3 languages at once, set there by a Persian king to boast of his deeds. 3 parallel columns of wedge writing saying, it was reasoned, the same thing in 3 different tongues, one of which could eventually be worked out. And from that Rosetta-like key, letter by agonizing letter, sound by uncertain sound, the scholars pried their way into the script, guessing at the names of kings they already knew from other sources, testing, failing, correcting, until slowly, impossibly, the wedges began to yield, to resolve into sounds, and the sounds into words, and the words into sentences, and the dead language spoke. There was, understandably, deep doubt at first, for how could anyone truly know they had read correctly a script and a tongue that no living person had understood for 2,000 years, and so, in a famous test. Several scholars who had been working separately were each given a copy of the same newly discovered inscription, sealed, and asked to translate it alone, without consulting one another, and their sealed translations were opened together and compared. And they agreed, closely enough that no one could any longer reasonably doubt it, and the thing was proven. The code was broken. The door that the last scribe had let swing shut was open once more, and the whole immense buried library of Mesopotamia, all those tens of thousands of tablets, could now painstakingly, tablet by tablet, be read. And so began the long, still continuing work of listening to the dead, of reading the accounts and the letters and the laws and the school exercises and the love poems and the laments and the star charts of a people who had been silent for 2,000 years, and it is because of that work, because of the diggers in the mounds and the scholars bent over the wedges, that we know any of what we have spoken of tonight, that Gilgamesh is a name to us and not a blank, that Hammurabi's laws can be read and Enheduanna's hymns can be sung, and the last scribe's final tablet can be dated, that the first civilization on earth is not, as it was for so many centuries, merely a rumour and a warning and a mound of grass, but a real and knowable and endlessly human world, given back to us out of the dust in our own late age, so that a person lying quietly in the dark tonight can walk through all of it, from the first fire on the empty plain to the last tablet in the ruined temple, and feel, across 5,000 years, the nearness of people who were, in every way that matters, exactly like us. And so, as the story comes down toward its rest, let us gather up, slowly and without hurry, the gifts, because that is the truest way to measure a civilization, not by the empires it raised, which all fell, nor by the kings it crowned, who all died, nor even by the cities it built, which all became grass, but by what it handed forward, by what it set into the current of human life that has never since been taken out again, and by that measure the land between the two rivers is one of the most generous places that has ever existed, a place whose gifts you have already used a dozen times today without ever once thinking of the plain, or the reeds, or the mud from which they came. Consider first the written word itself, which we owe, as far as we can trace it, to the patient accountants of Uruk and their wedges in the clay. For this was the place where human beings first found a way to take a thought out of a living mind and set it down in the world where it could outlast the thinker, and every book you have ever read, every letter, every law, every story, every message glowing on every screen, descends in an unbroken line from that first receipt for barley, is a child of that first great act of making clay remember, so that when you read these words, or any words, you are doing a thing that was invented, once for the first time on that plain. Consider the city, the very idea of thousands upon thousands of strangers living packed together behind a wall, fed by fields they do not themselves farm, ordered by laws and officials and shared gods, for the city too was born here, at Uruk, the first true city on earth, and every city that has ever risen since, every crowded street and towering skyline and lit-up avenue in the whole world. Tonight is, in the deepest sense, a descendant of that first experiment in living together in great numbers, first tried out here, in the reeds, by people feeling their way, with no example anywhere to follow. Consider the wheel, which the potters of Sumer turned first for their clay, and which was then set on its edge and put beneath a cart, so that every wheel that has ever turned, on every road and every railway and every machine, is a grandchild of the potter's wheel of the plain. Consider the law, the written, public, fixed law standing above the whim of the powerful, reached for first on the clay of Ur-Nammu and carved most famously into the black stone of Hammurabi. The idea that a wronged person might point to something written and say, "Here, this is my right," an idea so precious and so hard won that the human race is still, 5,000 years later, struggling to live up to it, and that began here. Consider the way you carve up time itself, for when you glance at a clock and see that the hour has 60 minutes and the minute has 60 seconds, and when you speak of the circle as having 360 degrees you are using, without knowing it, the counting system of the Sumerian scribes who reckoned in 60s under the ziggurat of Ur, a way of dividing the hour and the circle that has clung to us so tightly across so many thousands of years and so many changes of empire and language and faith, that we still keep the time of day, tonight, by the arithmetic of a people who have been dust for 4,000 years. Consider the stars and the 12 signs of the zodiac, mapped out on those flat Babylonian rooftops by the anxious priests who watched the heavens for the intentions of the gods, and who, in their watching, became the first true astronomers, keeping records so long and so careful that they could predict the eclipse and chart the wanderings of the planets. And who handed that watching down? Through the Greeks and the Arabs and the long chain of astronomers ever since, all the way to us. And consider last and deepest the stories, for it was here that the human race first wrote down its dreams and its fears about the great questions, about where the world came from and why we must die, and what we owe to one another and to the powers above us, and the shapes of those first stories. The flood that drowns the world and the one righteous man who is saved in a great boat. The hero who journeys to the ends of the earth in search of everlasting life and learns, instead, to treasure the life he has, the infant set adrift upon the river in a basket of reeds and saved to become a saviour of his people. These shapes were poured, first, here, into the clay, and they flowed outward and downward through all the ages and into the sacred books and the beloved tales of a large part of the human family. So that when we tell our children the old stories, we are often, without knowing it, telling them stories that were already ancient, already worn smooth by many hands when the last scribe of Babylon closed the door. All of this, the writing and the city and the wheel and the law and the 60 minutes of the hour and the 12 signs of the sky and the oldest stories in the world, all of it came from that one flat plain between the two slow rivers, from that one civilization that rose out of the mud with no example to follow and worked out, for the first time, so many of the fundamental things that we still live by, and then fell and was forgotten and gave its gifts anyway, gave them so quietly and so completely that we use them every single day and never think to say thank you, never think of the reeds and the tablets and the ziggurats at all. So perhaps tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might think of them just for a moment with something like gratitude, the nameless people of the plain, the first farmers and the first scribes and the first city dwellers and the first star watchers, who lived their short bright lives under the same moon that is somewhere in your sky right now, and who, without ever knowing it, without ever meaning to, built the ground beneath our feet, the invisible foundation of the ordinary world, so patiently and so well that it has held up everything we have built on top of it for 5,000 years, and holds it still, and holds in its quiet way even you, lying here in the warm dark, at the far end of the longest story there is. Among the many things the diggers brought back up into the light, out of the long low mounds of the south, there is one discovery so rich and so strange and so touched with sorrow that it deserves a slow and quiet place of its own here near the end of our night, and it is the discovery at the ancient city of Ur, the moon god's city of the royal graves. Sunk deep beneath the floors of the dead city, untouched for 4,500 years, from a time even before Sargon, from the old days when Ur was one of the proud independent cities of Sumer. The excavator who found them worked with great patience through the layers of the dead city, and came at last upon a cemetery, and within the cemetery, deeper and grander than the rest, upon a handful of tombs so magnificent that he called them, for want of any better word, the royal tombs, the burials of the kings and queens of early Ur, and what he lifted out of them, cleaning the earth away grain by grain with brushes and picks as fine as needles, was a treasure to rival any in the ancient world, and a scene to trouble the heart forever. For here was gold, worked with a delicacy that no one had imagined the earliest Sumerians could command, golden vessels and golden daggers with hilts of blue lapis, and above all the personal ornaments of a queen, laid in her grave with her body. An elaborate and glorious headdress of golden leaves and golden flowers, and long strands of golden lapis and red carnelian, great crescent earrings of gold, a golden comb crowned with golden blossoms, so that when it was carefully reassembled and set out, the world could see, dazzled, exactly how a great lady of had been adorned 4,500 years ago, in a splendour no one had dreamed still lay waiting under the grass. And here, too, were the lyres, the musical instruments of the court, their wooden frames long rotted away to nothing but their shape preserved in the earth, and their glory intact. For they had been decorated with a magnificent head of a bull worked in gold and lapis, the bull's beard a cascade of deep blue stone, and to look upon that golden bull's head, its calm and noble face gazing out across 4,500 years, is to understand at once that these were not rude and simple people at the dawn of things, but a civilization already mature, already in full command of beauty, already able to make an object so fine that it stops the breath of anyone who stands before it today. But the royal tombs of held, along with their gold and their music, a darker and sadder thing, for the kings and queens of that ancient city had not gone down into the grave alone. Around the great figures, in the wide pits that held the royal burials, the excavator found the bodies of others, many others, dozens of them, the attendants of the court, the soldiers with their spears at the entrance, the grooms with the oxen and the wagons, the fine ladies of the household in their own lesser ornaments of gold and silver, the musicians with their hands, it seemed, still near their instruments, all of them laid out in careful rows, in their finery, as if for a great ceremony, and all of them dead, gone down into the earth with their lord or their lady to serve, it appears, in whatever grey world came after. It seems that when a great one of died, in those old days a whole company of the court went down into the tomb with them, dressed in their best, and there, in the pit, in some solemn ritual we can only dimly imagine, took their own quiet leave of the light, perhaps by a cup of something that eased them gently out of the world, and lay down in their rows and slept, so that their king or their queen would not have to cross over into the house of dust alone. It is a terrible thing, and we should not soften it into something pretty, and yet there is, in the archaeologist's careful account of how they were found, each in their place, each in their finery, each composed and unharmed and at rest, a strange and awful dignity, the sense of people who went to their deaths not as victims dragged and slaughtered, but as a devoted household, following their lord into the dark of their own accord, in the deep and total faith of their age, and lay down together and closed their eyes and were still. We do not share their faith, and we would not, could not, do as they did, and it is right that such customs passed away and did not last. But as you lie here tonight, warm and safe and free, at the far end of all those thousands of years, you might spare a gentle thought for the musicians of lying in their rows in the golden dark with their hands near their silent lyres, 4,500 years asleep, and be glad, quietly glad, that your own sleep tonight asks nothing of you but rest, that you may close your eyes not in any pit and not in any ritual, but simply in your own soft bed, and drift away, and wake again, easily, in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning, which is a gift those long-ago sleepers of for all their gold, were never given, and which we, who have so little gold by comparison, are given, freely. Every single night of our lives. Let us leave the tombs and the kings and the empires behind us now, all of them, and spend a little of the last of our night simply walking, slowly, through a single ordinary day in one of those ancient cities at the height of its life. Because that is perhaps the gentlest way of all to say goodbye to it, to see it not as a thing that rose and fell, but as a place where people once woke, and lived a day, and slept again, exactly as you are about to do. So let the day begin before the dawn, in the grey hush before the heat, when the city is still and cool and the only sounds are the first birds in the date palms and the soft slap of the river against the quays. In the houses built around their small inward courtyards, the families are stirring, the women grinding the day's grain on the saddle-shaped stones, the low rhythmic scrape of stone on stone rising from 1,000 courtyards at once, the oldest sound of the morning, and the smell of the first bread baking against the hot walls of the clay ovens beginning to drift out over the flat rooftops. The sun comes up enormous and red over the eastern plain, over the 2 rivers, and the light runs along the top of the great ziggurat first, catching its summit shrine while the streets below are still in shadow, and then pours slowly down the terraced sides and out across the rooftops and into the lanes, and the city wakes in earnest. The gates in the great walls are opened, and the farmers come in from the fields with their donkeys laden with vegetables and their baskets of dates and their fish still cool from the canals, and the market by the temple fills with the noise and the colour and the haggling of the day, the potters and the weavers and the leather workers and the sellers of beer. The scribes sitting cross-legged with their tablets and their reeds ready to write a letter or a contract for anyone who has a copper to pay, the smell of fish and dung and baking bread, and the river and the dust all mixed together in the warming air. In the great temple, the priests go about the morning service of the god, washing and clothing and feeding the statue with the first meal of the day, the offerings of bread and beer and meat carried in and set before the divine presence with prayer and with music, while out in the fields beyond the walls the labourers are already at their endless work, clearing the canals, raising the water into the higher channels, tending the barley and the date palms, bent under the sun that climbs higher and grows fiercer, until, in the dead middle of the day, the whole city seems to pause, the streets emptying, the people retreating into the shaded rooms and the cool courtyards, the animals dozing in what shadow they can find. Everything holding still through the worst of the heat while the 2 rivers slide on, brown and patient, glittering under the white noon. And then the long afternoon, the heat softening by slow degrees, the shadows creeping out again from the eastern walls, the city stirring back to life, the second round of work and trade and talk, and at last the great gift of the day, the evening, when the sun swells and reddens and sinks toward the western desert, and the whole flat world turns to amber and rose, and then to a deep and glowing gold. The workers come in from the fields, tired and dusty, and the gates are closed for the night, and the families gather in their courtyards for the evening meal, the bread and the onions, and the dates and the fish, the thick nourishing beer sipped in the cooling air, the children fed and the day's small news exchanged, the old people telling the old stories that they themselves heard as children, the story of the flood, the story of the hero, the story of how the gods made the first people out of the river clay. Up on the flat rooftops, as the last light fades, the families spread their mats to sleep in the open where it is cool, and the stars come out over the plain, the same stars the priests are watching from the summit of the ziggurat, the wandering planets and the fixed and patient constellations wheeling slowly across the enormous dark, and the lamps are put out one by one across the city, small warm points of light winking out in the courtyards and the windows, until the whole great city lies quiet under the stars, its walls and its temples and its towers all dark and still, its thousands of people asleep on their rooftops and their mats, breathing slowly in the warm night, dreaming their ancient dreams, while the 2 rivers move on through the dark plain, unhurried, unbothered, carrying the starlight down toward the distant sea. And that, in the end, is what the great civilization of the 2 rivers was. Beneath all its kings and its wars and its gold, it was people, ordinary people, waking and working and eating and telling stories and lying down at night to sleep under the stars day after day for 3,000 years, and then, when their own long day was over, lying down for the last time and letting it all go, exactly as you are about to let this day go now, easily, gently, with nothing left to do and nowhere left to be, into the same deep and dreamless sleep that has closed over every one of them, and every one of us, since the very first fire was lit on the empty plain. There is one more small story from the earliest days that is worth carrying off into sleep, from long before the great empires, back in the time of the quarrelling city-states, when Sumer was still a scatter of proud independent cities, each ruling its own watered fields, and it is a story that shows us, as clearly as anything in this whole long history, that the deepest human concerns have not changed at all across 5,000 years. In the old city of Lagash in those early centuries, the kings and the temple officials and the powerful men had over generations done what powerful men so often do when no one stops them. They had reached out and taken more and more land, more labour, more of the goods and the rights that had once belonged to the ordinary people, until the common folk of Lagash groaned under a weight of taxes and dues and petty officials and grasping overseers that had grown, tax by tax and seizure by seizure, into something close to unbearable. The tax collectors were everywhere, we are told, taking their cut of everything, of the shearing of the sheep and the divorce of a wife and the burial of the dead, so that a man could not even lay his father in the ground without an official appearing to demand his portion of beer and bread and silver, and the great men seized the gardens and the wells of the poor. And the boatman's boat was taken, and the herdsman's donkey was taken, and the small people had no one to appeal to, because the ones who should have protected them were the very ones doing the taking. And then there came to the throne of Lagash a new ruler, a man named Urukagina, and he did something that had, as far as we know, never been done before in the history of the world, something so new that we have to reach a little to find the words for it, because he made reforms, deliberate, sweeping reforms, in the name of the ordinary people, and he had them written down. He swept away the swarm of grasping officials and cut the burdensome dues, and forbade the powerful from seizing the goods of the poor, and put a stop to the worst of the abuses. And he set it all down in clay for everyone to know, and in the text that records what he did there appears a word, a Sumerian word, that scholars translate, with a small thrill every time, as freedom or liberty. And it is, as far as anyone has ever found, the first appearance of that word, the word freedom, in any human language, anywhere, in the whole written record of humankind. The first time the human race ever wrote down the idea of freedom, it wrote it here, on the plain between the rivers, more than 4,000 years ago, to describe what a king had granted to his groaning people when he lifted the weight of the powerful off their backs. And there is something almost unbearably moving in that the very first written cry for the dignity of ordinary people against the greed of the strong should reach us from so unimaginably far back, from the very dawn of writing itself, as if the concern for justice and freedom were not some late and fragile invention of the modern world, but one of the oldest things in the human heart, present at the very beginning, written down almost as soon as there was any writing at all. Urukagina's reforms, we should say gently, did not last, for his city was not long after conquered by a rival, and the old abuses no doubt crept back, as they always do, the way water seeps back into a hole you have dug in wet ground, and this, too, is part of the truth of the story, that the fight for justice is never won once and for all but must be fought and fought again in every generation, that the powerful always reach out to take more, and the ordinary people must always find again the courage and the leaders to stop them, and that the word freedom, first written in Lagash, has had to be written again, and fought for again in 10,000 places and 10,000 times in all the ages since. But it was written. That is the thing to hold. On a small tablet of clay in a small city 4,000 years ago, a human being wrote down, for the first time, the idea that ordinary people should not be crushed by the strong, and gave it a name, and that tablet survived, baked hard in the dry earth. Through the fall of Lagash and the rise and fall of every empire that came after, through the long 2,000-year silence, to be dug up and read again in our own age, so that we know now that the dream of freedom is as old as writing, as old as the city, as old as civilization itself, and that it began, like so much else, here, on this plain, by these rivers, among these people who lie so long asleep, and who left it to us, along with everything else, as quietly and as generously as they left us the wheel and the word and the 60 minutes of this passing hour. Let us return, one last time, to the rivers themselves and to the land they made, because in the end they are the true and lasting heroes of this whole story, more enduring than any king, more patient than any empire, the two great slow presences that were here before the first fire and are here still, tonight, moving through the plain in the dark exactly as they have always moved. The Tigris and the Euphrates rose in the far northern mountains and ran the length of the land, and everything, absolutely everything, depended upon them, and upon their strange, generous, dangerous yearly rhythm. For in that hot southern country there was almost no rain to speak of, and the crops could not live on the sky, and so they lived on the rivers, which rose each year, swollen with the melting snows of the distant mountains, and spread themselves across the flat land, and when they withdrew they left behind that fresh skin of dark rich silt that renewed the fields and made the whole civilization possible. But the rivers were not gentle or reliable in the way of a kindly gardener. They were wild and moody and unpredictable, and this shaped the very soul of the people who depended on them. For the great flood came not in the winter, when the fields were resting, but in the spring, at the very worst time, when the young grain was ripening and could be drowned and ruined by too much water as easily as it could be starved by too little, so that the farmers of the plain lived always on a knife's edge between drought and deluge, between the river that gave too little and the river that gave too much, and had to labour endlessly at their dikes and their canals and their basins to hold the water back when it raged, and to store it and dole it out when it failed. And the rivers moved. This is one of the strangest and most sobering facts of the whole land, that the rivers themselves, over the centuries, did not stay in their beds but wandered, shifting their courses across the flat plain, breaking their banks in some great flood, and carving out a new channel miles away, so that a city that had been built upon the river, that had lived by its water and traded along its banks and drawn its very life from it, might find, over a lifetime or two, that the river had simply left, moved off across the plain to a new bed, leaving the city stranded and dying beside a dry and dusty channel, its harbour a hollow, its canals empty, its people drifting away to follow the water, until the great city was abandoned altogether and left to melt back into the mud, killed not by any army, but by the quiet wandering of the river that had made it. So that the rises and falls of the cities of Mesopotamia were written, in the deepest way, not only in the wars of kings, but in the moods and the wanderings of the two rivers, which built the cities up and then, in their own slow time, took them away. And in the far south, where the two rivers drew together and slowed and spread toward the gulf, there lay, and there lies still, a great and secret country of marshes, a vast wetland of still water and tall reeds, where the water lies warm and shining between countless small islands of dry ground, and where from the very earliest times a particular people made their home. The marsh dwellers who built their houses and even their great arching halls entirely of reeds, bundling and bending the tall reeds into soaring vaulted structures of astonishing beauty, and who moved through the still water in slender canoes, and who fished and hunted the wildfowl, and pastured their water buffalo among the reed beds, and who lived in that hidden green world. A life that changed so little across the ages that a visitor in modern times, gliding through the reeds in a canoe past the great reed halls, could feel that they had slipped somehow out of the present altogether and back into the world of Sumer, into the very landscape of the oldest stories, the reed marsh at the beginning of the world, where the gods made the first people out of the clay. For the reeds and the water and the buffalo and the slender canoes and the arching reed houses of the marshes are, quite possibly, the oldest continuous way of life on the face of the earth, a way of living that was old when Uruk was young, that carried on, quietly, in the still green heart of the wetlands, through the rise and fall of every empire we have spoken of tonight, through Sumer and Akkad and Babylon and Assyria and Persia and all the ages since, largely unbothered by any of it, because the marsh people wanted nothing the kings wanted, and had nothing the kings could easily take, and so were mostly left alone, to fish and to pole their canoes and to bend their reeds, in the timeless warm green quiet, for 5,000 years. and it is a good and peaceful thing to hold in the mind at the very end of this long journey through the rise and fall of the mightiest powers of the ancient world. That beneath all of it, quieter than all of it, older than all of it, the simple life of the reeds and the water went on, and largely still goes on, and that the two great rivers that made everything and unmade everything are still. There, in the warm dark, moving slowly through the flat plain toward the sea, exactly as they moved before there were any cities, or kings, or empires, or names, and exactly as they will move, unhurried and unbothered, long after the last of us has gone to sleep. Before the very last of the night, let us tell one of their myths in full, slowly, the way it would have been told, because a civilization is known most intimately not by its kings, but by its dreams, by the stories it told itself in the dark to make sense of the great mysteries. And the people of the plain told, among all their stories, one that is among the oldest and strangest and most beautiful in the whole treasury of human myth. The story of the descent of the great goddess into the world below, the goddess of love and of war, the morning and the evening star, the most passionate and powerful of all the powers of heaven, resolved, for reasons the story leaves as deep and unexplained as such reasons always are, to go down into the underworld, into the great below, the grey house of dust from which no traveller returns, the kingdom of her own dread sister who ruled the dead. And so she arrayed herself in all her glory, in the 7 ornaments of her divine power, the crown upon her head, the rod of measurement in her hand, the strings of lapis about her neck, the ornaments upon her breast, the golden ring, the gleaming robe, all the signs and instruments of her queenship over heaven, and she set out. And she came to the first gate of the world below, and demanded to be let in. But the world below has its own laws, older and more implacable than the laws of heaven, and its rule was this, that none may enter except as the dead enter, stripped of everything, bringing nothing, keeping nothing, and so at the first gate the gatekeeper took from her the great crown upon her head, and when she asked why, she was told only that the ways of the underworld are perfect and may not be questioned. And she passed through the first gate, and came to the second, and there they took the rod from her hand, and at the third they took the lapis from her neck, and at the fourth the ornaments from her breast, and at the fifth the golden ring, and at the 6th the measuring line. And at the 7th and last gate they took from her the gleaming robe itself, so that she came at last into the presence of her terrible sister, the queen of the dead, naked and stripped of all her power, brought low, made helpless, exactly as every mortal is brought low and stripped and made helpless at the end. And there the judges of the underworld fastened their eyes upon her, the eyes of death, and she was struck down, and turned into a corpse, and hung upon a hook upon the wall, in the grey silence, in the house of dust, the great and shining goddess of heaven herself, dead, in the dark, like any other. And in heaven above, her faithful servant waited the 3 days and 3 nights that the goddess had appointed, and when she did not return, the servant went, as she had been instructed, and pleaded with the great gods to save her mistress, and most of them turned away, for the laws of the underworld were not to be undone even by the highest. But one god, the wise god of the sweet waters and of cunning, took pity, and from the dirt beneath his fingernails he fashioned 2 small strange creatures, beings that were neither living nor dead, and so could pass into the world below unclaimed. And he sent them down with the food of life and the water of life, and instructed them how to win the release of the goddess. And they crept down through the 7 gates, and found her corpse upon the hook, and sprinkled upon her the food of life and the water of life. And the goddess stirred, and rose, and lived again, and began to climb back up toward the light. But the underworld does not give up its own for nothing, and its law demanded that if she was to return to the world above, someone must take her place in the world below, and so she came back up into the light, trailed by the grim demons of the dead, who would seize whomever she named to go down in her stead, and she would not name her faithful servant, who had mourned her. And she would not name the loyal ones who had grieved. But when she came at last to her own husband, and found that he had not mourned her at all, that he had dressed himself in his finest robes, and seated himself upon her throne, and made merry in her absence as though he were glad she was gone. Then her eyes upon him became the eyes of death, and she named him. And the demons seized him and dragged him down, and so, in the end, it was arranged, through the grief of his sister who loved him, that he would spend half the year below and half above. And that is why the people of the plain believed the world has its seasons, why the green things wither and die and go down into the earth for half the year and then rise again, because the shepherd god goes down into the dark and comes back up into the light, down and up, death and life, winter and spring, in the endless turning that governs all growing things. It is a strange story, and a sad one, and yet there is a deep comfort woven all through it. The comfort of a people who looked without flinching at the fact of death, at the stripping away of everything at the last gate, at the descent into the dark, and who yet believed, and put into their oldest story, that the descent is not always the end, that even the goddess who was made a corpse upon the wall could be sprinkled with the water of life and rise and climb again toward the light, that the green things that die go down only to come back up. That winter, however long and grey, gives way always to spring. And that is a good thought to carry down with you now into your own small nightly descent, your own going down into the soft dark of sleep, that it is not an ending but only a turning, that you lay yourself down and let everything be stripped away, the day, the thoughts, the cares, gate by gate, until you pass at last into the deep and dreamless quiet, and that you will rise again, sprinkled with the water of the morning, and climb back up into the light, easily, as you have every morning of your life, as the goddess climbed, as the green things climb, as the whole turning world climbs, forever, up out of the dark and into the day. And now, as the night draws in around us, and the story folds itself gently toward its close, let us stand back, for one last long moment, and look at the whole of it at once, the entire 3,000 years of it, laid out from beginning to end, the way you might look down upon the plain from a great height in the last of the evening light, seeing it all spread below you, calm and small and complete. Remember how the Sumerians themselves understood their history, that old and haunting idea that kingship had come down from heaven and had rested first upon one city, and then, when that city fell, had passed to another, moving across the land from age to age, so that the whole story could be told as the wandering of a single lamp, handed from hand to hand down the long dark corridor of time. Watch it wander now. See it rest first upon Uruk in the mist at the very beginning, where the wall was raised and the writing was born, and the hero built the ramparts he told his friend to look upon. See it pass among the quarrelling cities of Sumer, to Ur and Kish and Lagash, where the first laws were carved and the first word for freedom was written, and the kings and queens went down into the golden tombs with their silent musicians. See the lamp lifted up by the gardener who became an emperor, and carried further than any had carried it before, across the whole of the land, into the first empire the world had ever seen, and see that empire fall, as the rains failed and the mountain men came down. See the lamp return to Ur for its last great flowering, the ziggurat raised that stands to this day, and then the lament sung over Ur when the enemy broke in. See it taken up by the patient Amorite king of a small city called Babylon, and by the black stone he raised to be remembered as just. See it carried north into the hard country, and there set into the terrible and magnificent hand of Assyria. The war machine and the library both. The flayed enemies and the weeping stone lioness on the same wall. See Assyria fall in a single burning, hated by the whole world, its capital sunk so deep beneath the grass that men doubted it had ever been. See the lamp come back, one last time to Babylon, to its final and most dazzling glory under the great king, the blue and golden gate, and the hanging gardens and the tower that touched the sky, and the captives weeping by the rivers. And see, at last, on a single night, the lamp go out, as the Persian walked into Babylon and the 3,000-year line of native kings came, quietly, without a great battle, to its end, and the centre of the world moved elsewhere and never came back. All of it, The whole vast procession, rising and shining and falling, each empire certain in its hour that it was eternal. Each king believing that his walls would stand forever and his name would never be forgotten, and every one of them, in the end, thrown down and buried, and forgotten so completely that their very existence became a doubtful rumour, until the spades of a far-off age dug them up again and gave them back to us as a story to tell in the dark. And here is the thing, the quiet thing, the thing worth carrying down into sleep, that this is not a sad story, though it is full of falls, and it is not a frightening story, though it is full of endings, because running underneath every rise and every fall, steadier than any of them, there is the other story, the one that never ends, the story of the ordinary and the enduring. The kings fell, but the wheel kept turning for the potter. The empires burned, but the bread kept baking against the hot clay walls. The libraries were buried, but the stories inside them, the flood and the hero and the descent of the goddess, went on being told at 1,000 hearths and flowed out into all the world, and are told, some of them, still, the cities melted back into the mud. But the idea of the city went on, and the writing went on, and the law went on, and the counting of the hour in 60s went on, and the watching of the stars went on, handed forward and forward and forward across all the falling empires, from those first patient people to us, so that the true monument of Mesopotamia is not any ziggurat or any palace or any golden gate, all of which fell, but the invisible foundation it laid beneath the ordinary life of the whole human race, which did not fall, which has never fallen, which holds up your own ordinary life tonight so quietly and so completely that you have never once had to think about it. History, one of their own inheritors would much later say, does not really disappear. It just becomes the ground beneath our feet. And that is exactly what the land between the two rivers has become, the ground beneath our feet, the deep and buried foundation of the everyday world, so far down and so long ago that we walk upon it every hour of every day and never feel it there, holding us up, the first city and the first word and the first law and the first freedom, all of it pressed down into the deep foundation of things, all of it become, at last, simply the floor of the world we live in, the solid and forgotten ground on which everything else has been built, on which you too are resting now, safely in the warm dark, at the far end of the longest and oldest story there is, the story that began with a single fire on an empty plain and has come down, across 5,000 years unbroken, all the way to you. There is one last small human picture I would like to leave you with before we say our good night, and it is not a king or a battle or a golden treasure, but a boy, an ordinary boy, at school, 4,000 years ago, because among all the tens of thousands of tablets that have come back to us out of the earth, some of the most touching are the exercise tablets and the little stories of the tablet. House, the school where the scribes were made, and through them we can see, with a clarity that is almost unbearable, a child exactly like a child of today. We have his day, set down in his own school essay, and it is a day any tired schoolchild across all of history would know in their bones. He wakes, and he is afraid of being late, and he hurries his mother for his lunch, 2 rolls and rushes off to school, and when he arrives late anyway the teacher canes him. And through the long day, one after another, the monitors and the masters find fault with him, for talking, for standing without leave, for sloppy work, for a poorly made tablet, for his handwriting. And each fault brings its punishment, until the boy, weary and sore and discouraged, goes home and suggests to his father that perhaps the teacher might be invited to the house for dinner, and given a little something, a gift, a kindness. And his father, understanding perfectly, does exactly that, welcomes the teacher, seats him in the place of honour, pours him good beer, dresses him in a new garment, slips a ring upon his finger, and the teacher, warmed and flattered, turns to the anxious boy and praises him at last, tells him he will become a fine scribe, the finest of his brothers. And the essay ends in the boy's small glow of relief and triumph. It is 4,000 years old, and there is not one thing in it that a person alive today cannot feel in their own chest. The dread of being late, the sting of the endless corrections, the longing to be told just once that you have done well, and the quiet human machinery of a parent smoothing the way for an unhappy child. And that, in the end, is the deepest thing the buried tablets give back to us. Deeper than the kings and the wars and the empires, the simple, overwhelming, tender fact that these were people, wholly and exactly people, that a boy dreaded school and a mother packed a lunch, and a father saw his child was sad and did something about it 4,000 years ago on the plain between the rivers. Under the same sun and the same moon and the same wheeling stars that are over you tonight. The distance between us and them is vast beyond imagining. 3, 4, 5,000 years, whole languages dead, whole gods forgotten, the very script they wrote in Lost for 2 millennia and painfully won back. And yet the distance is also nothing at all, no distance whatsoever. Because a tired child is a tired child, and a worried parent is a worried parent, and the wish to lie down at the end of a hard day and let it all go is the same wish. Exactly the same. In Uruk, and in Ur, and in Babylon, and in your own quiet room tonight. They lived, and they worked, and they loved their children, and they told their stories, and they lay down when the day was done, and they slept. And now they have been sleeping for a very long time. All of them, the boy and his teacher and his mother and his father, the scribe and the king and the queen in her golden headdress, and the musicians with their hands near their silent lyres, all of them long, long asleep beneath the low green mounds by the 2 slow rivers, and it did them no harm, and it holds no terror. It was only rest. In the end, only the laying down of a finished day, only sleep. And so it is for you, tonight, only rest, only the gentle laying down of a day that is finished now, that asks nothing more of you, that you may set down entirely and completely, the way the boy set down his tablet, the way the city put out its lamps one by one, the way the whole long story we have walked through tonight has been set down at last into the quiet earth to sleep. And so we come to the end of our long walk between the rivers, from the first small fire on the empty plain to the last tablet in the ruined temple, from the birth of the city and the word to the fall of the Golden Gate, and there is nothing left now but to rest. Are you still awake? If you are, there is no need to be, not any longer, for the story is told, and the night is deep, and there is nothing more you need to follow, nowhere else you need to go. If you are still awake, there is another quiet journey waiting for you on the screen when you are ready for it. Another long and gentle night of history to carry you off into sleep. And it will keep. It will wait for you. There is no hurry at all. And if these slow journeys through the ancient world are a comfort to you, if this soft voice in the dark helps to loosen the day from your shoulders and ease you down towards sleep, then you are always welcome to leave a gentle like and to subscribe, so that we can find our way back to each other on another night, but only, as ever, if it brings you a little ease, and only if it costs you no effort at all. Perhaps, before you drift off entirely, you might leave your location and your local time down in the comments, whatever hour it happens to be where you are lying now, because it is a quiet comfort to all of us, this scattered company of the sleepless and the restful, to know that all across the world, in every time zone and every season, in cities and villages and quiet rooms, others are lying in the dark just as you are, listening to the same slow story, breathing the same slow breath, sinking toward the same easy sleep. And now let the 2 rivers move on through the dark without you. Let the low green mounds keep their long sleep under the stars. Let the boy and his tablet, and the queen in her gold, and the last scribe with his final wedge of clay, and all the countless people of the plain go on resting where they have rested for so many thousands of years, gently and without fear. Let your breathing slow. Let the small weight of the day, whatever it held, slip all the way down and off and away. Let your eyes stay closed, and your body grow heavy and warm and still, and let the whole long story sink down beneath you into the deep foundation of things, the ground beneath your feet, where it will hold you up, safe and steady, all through the night. There is nothing more to do. There is nothing more to carry. There is only the dark and the quiet, and the rest you have earned, and the certainty, as old as the first morning on the plain, that you will rise again, easily, into the light when the night is done. Close your eyes now. Let it all go. Good night and sweet dreams.